Hello, my dear friends. Victorian women could go months without a single bath, and most people around them saw nothing strange in it. Their choices were shaped by cold rooms, dangerous water, strict beliefs, and silent rules that governed every corner of daily life. What looked like neglect from the outside was, in truth, a careful system built from fear, scarcity, and expectation. Tonight, we step quietly into that world to see why bathing became the rarest act of all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together. If someone wandered through a modest Victorian home at the break of day, they would find a small pot sitting on the iron stove, its thin trail of steam rising like a fragile promise rather than a guarantee of warmth. The water inside would barely cover the bottom, slowly heating only because the family had scraped together the last bits of coal from a bucket that always seemed close to empty. For many households, obtaining warm water was less a simple task, and more a constant negotiation with time, weather, and resources that rarely stretched far enough. Fuel costs money, and fire demanded attention. So every moment spent coaxing a pot to simmer meant another moment stolen from work that determined whether a family could keep a roof overhead. Victorian women understood this reality too well. Standing before stoves that never seemed hot enough, watching the fire shrink, knowing that the water they needed for washing their bodies was slipping away as quickly as the heat that tried to warm it. Even on days when they patiently waited, stirring and checking the water, the cold air of the house pressed in on them, stealing heat faster than the stove could offer it back. In many cramped dwellings, warm water never existed in any meaningful quantity. Families lacked deep basins or sturdy tubs that could hold enough water for a proper bath. So the idea of soaking in warmth as a way to cleanse the body was not only impractical but unthinkable. A handful of tin pails, dented and thin served every need, from cleaning dishes to soaking laundry, and a woman knew that dedicating precious water to her own comfort was a luxury she could not justify. This scarcity created a rhythm of daily life where cleanliness depended not on desire but on mathematics, on calculating how much warmth could survive against the cold that seeped through walls and floorboards. Even those who dared to attempt a fuller wash faced a discouraging reality. Water that left the stove hot quickly turned lukewarm as it was carried across the room, then cooled further the moment it met the air. The few minutes of warmth that remained were often gone before a woman could even begin washing her arms, leaving her shivering in a chill that bit into her bones. Winter deepened this hardship until it became a quiet cruelty. Houses rarely held heat well, and the simplest breeze slipping through a window frame could undo an hour of carefully tended fire. Women found themselves caught in a contradiction. Bathing required warmth, yet warmth was the very thing their homes could not keep. A basin filled with even slightly warmed water might turn cold the instant it touched the metal sides of the tin, or the coarse fabric of a washcloth. Fingers stiffened, breath shortened, and the idea of washing more than a small patch of skin felt like a punishment rather than relief. In households where children elders, and laundry already demanded endless labor. Few women were willing to endure the discomfort of stripping down in a room colder than the streets outside. The body recoiled at the shock, and the mind understood that getting warm again would cost more time and more fuel than the family could spare. For poorer families, the preparation of warm water meant sacrificing other needs. A morning fire might be saved for cooking porridge or boiling linens, not for a woman who simply wished to feel clean. The choice was never between comfort and inconvenience, but between survival and something far less significant. The weight of these decisions shaped the routines of women who learned to live with cold skin and layers of clothing that hid the absence of warmth beneath. In such conditions, bathing became a distant idealan activity reserved for those who lived in homes with better stoves, stronger walls, and enough coal to burn without worry. Victorian women did not refuse to bathe out of neglect, but out of an environment that carved away every opportunity to feel warm enough to attempt it. Even in moments when a woman gathered enough water to attempt a wash, the experience itself reinforced the futility. The steam vanished first, then the comfort, leaving behind only the awareness of how quickly the world reclaimed what little warmth she had created. The noise of wind rattling windows reminded her that cold was waiting to settle on her skin again the moment she stopped. Warm water was a brief visitor in a household that never welcomed it for long. To bathe under such conditions felt like asking for illness rather than cleanliness, and every story of a neighbor who grew sick after bathing in winter added to the quiet fear that circulated among women. They trusted their instincts, which told them that staying clothed and dry was safer than chasing temporary warmth that disappeared as quickly as hope. Over time, this scarcity shaped a culture where bathing was viewed not as a routine, but as an anomaly act that required more resources than most families could spare. Warm water was a privilege, not a guarantee, and its absence influenced every aspect of hygiene and daily life. Victorian women learned to adapt through necessity, choosing methods that kept them functional rather than comfortable, and in doing so accepted a world where warmth belonged to those who could afford to waste it. In households battling the cold, each day the simple act of heating water carried a weight that shaped choices far beyond the basin. The struggle to obtain warm water reveals how bathing became a rare event shaped by cold rooms and limited fuel. The daily compromises women made around heat opened the door to larger patterns of avoidance. Something else in their homes and communities deepened this reluctance in ways even warmth could not overcome. The water available to most Victorian households carried a heaviness that could be seen even before it touched the skin. In crowded neighborhoods where homes leaned into one another and narrow alleys funneled waste toward the lowest ground, wells stood as the only source of daily water. Yet they drew from soil permeated by refuse rather than purity. Every bucket pulled up from these dark shafts revealed more than water. Flecks of grit floated across the surface. Strands of hay drifted beneath, and the faintest tint of yellow or brown hinted at what lay upstream. Households gathered around these wells every morning because they had no other choice, lowering their pails past layers of contamination created by animals, overflowing privies, and heaps of rubbish that soaked into the earth. Victorian women, carrying these heavy buckets back home, often looked into them with a quiet resignation, already knowing that the water inside would never be clean enough to bathe in. Even when boiled, the smell lingered, and the film that clung to the sides of the pot testified to everything the fire had failed to burn away. Rivers offered no better salvation, flowing through the heart of industrial towns. They absorbed everything the factories expelled and everything households discarded. The surface shimmered with an oily sheen that fractured the light into dull, broken colors. Tangles of waste drifted along the banks, and the scent rising from the water carried a sourness that clung to the air long after someone walked past. Women couldn't imagine stepping into such water or pouring it over their bodies. The very thought of the river touching bare skin felt like an invitation to sickness. Barges and carts lined the edges of the waterway, their loads of coal, leather, scraps, and manure tumbling into the current as workers moved without concern for what it became. The river received all of it and carried it deeper into the city, where families still collected buckets, hoping that distance alone could purify what industry and neglect had tainted. Victorian women understood that the water they brought home was not simply unclean but dangerous, a quiet threat that lived in every drop inside their homes. This water revealed its limitations quickly. A basin filled with river water gave off a faint odor that deepened as it warmed on the stove, and the surface developed a thin cloudiness that made it impossible to see the bottom. Even if a woman ignored the scent and the murky hue, she could not ignore what remained on her skin after washing. Films of fine particles settled into the folds of the body, leaving behind a texture that felt more like residue than cleansing. For those who attempted to bathe with such water, the experience often ended in frustration or illness. Small cuts became inflamed, rashes spread beneath clothing. Children who washed their faces before bed woke with eyes irritated by unseen contaminants. Women learned quickly that the water offered no relief from grime, but simply replaced one kind of dirt with another. The irony was bitter. The very substance meant to cleanse them carried the seeds of sickness. In poorer districts, the scarcity of clean water deepened this cycle. Wells located near privies absorbed waste directly, and even water that looked clear could harbor dangers that eyes could not detect. Families crowded into narrow houses, shared the same sources, adding to the contamination every time buckets splashed on the ground or wastewater drained into the soil. Victorian women compensated by limiting their contact with water altogether, believing that avoiding it was safer than risking exposure to what it carried. Washing became a symbolic act rather than a physical one. They wiped their faces with damp cloths, brushed off dust from their clothing, and hoped these gestures could substitute for true cleanliness. The household became a place where water was rationed not only out of economic necessity, but out of fear. Some reformers attempted to warn communities about the dangers of polluted water, but their voices struggled to rise above the daily noise of survival. Industrial expansion offered employment, yet destroyed the purity of natural resources. To question the safety of water meant questioning the foundations of Victorian progress itself. Women bore the consequences in their own bodies. They lived with the knowledge that the water surrounding them, the water flowing through their town, the water rising in their own wells was never truly safe. Clean water became a luxury reserved for the wealthy. those whose homes were set higher on the landscape, away from waste, away from factories, away from the sewage that seeped into the ground. These households could boil water that actually smelled clean, could bathe without fear, and could enjoy a level of hygiene impossible for most families. Even then, Victorian society clung to the illusion that access to water was universal, municipal. Authorities boasted about pipes and pumps, while ignoring the neighborhoods where contamination was the only constant. The divide widened as the poor accepted their conditions as unchangeable Victorian. Women carried buckets through mud that had been soaked in filth, brought them home, and used the water sparingly because they saw no alternative. Each decision reinforced another. Bathing became an indulgence few could justify. Cleanliness became an expectation reserved for those who lived beyond the reach of polluted wells and poisoned rivers. The desire for hygiene faded beneath the weight of daily struggle. As water grew more unreliable, a quiet logic spread through these communities. Why bathe in water that made the body feel worse afterward? Why risk rashes, fever, or infection, simply for the sake of a ritual that brought no comfort and carried so much danger? This logic became woven into Victorian life, accepted without question. Mothers taught their daughters to avoid the river, to distrust the well, to wash only when necessary. These habits were not rooted in ignorance, but in survival. Women lived within a world where filth moved through every layer of the city, from the streets to the soil to the water itself, leaving no space for true cleanliness to take hold. Absence of clean water shaped a world where bathing felt more threatening than neglecting it. The choices families made around these sources carried consequences far beyond simple discomfort. Another force within Victorian society added its own layer of hesitation, turning avoidance into a practice that seemed almost reasonable. Medical authority in Victorian life carried a weight that few dared to challenge, and within that world, water itself was often spoken of as if it were a subtle adversary rather than a source of cleansing. Doctors who moved through the narrow streets with their leather bags and solemn manner encouraged ideas that threaded through households with quiet persistence. They believed the body possessed a delicate internal balance, one that could be disrupted by contact with water that seemed harmless on the surface, yet held the power to weaken the constitution. Many physicians spoke of the body as if it were a fragile vessel whose strength leaked away when exposed to moisture. And these warnings settled into the minds of women who were already wary of the risks surrounding them. Houses with cold floors and drafty windows felt hostile enough, but the thought that bathing could erode vitality turned the simple act into a threat that lingered in the background of daily routines. Within the medical texts and informal conversations that shaped public understanding, the opening of pores became a point of obsession. Doctors argued that warm water coaxed the skin to relax, leaving tiny openings through which invisible agents of illness could slip without resistance. For women caring for children, elders, and themselves in environments where disease was common, this explanation felt plausible. They lived among fevers that rose without warning, coughs that echoed through rooms, and infections that spread faster than they could prevent. When physicians insisted that bathing allowed sickness to find its way into the body, households accepted the warning as practical wisdom rather than superstition. A body kept dry and covered was a body protected. A woman who avoided full immersion or prolonged washing was not neglecting cleanliness, but guarding her health in the only way she believed possible. The influence of these ideas grew stronger as they intertwined with the uncertainties of Victorian urban life. Streets were crowded, homes were small, and illnesses circulated freely. Each winter brought waves of respiratory infections that shaped the fears of families. And in this environment, a doctor's advice to limit exposure to water felt like sound strategy. Many women internalized the notion that bathing could drain the strength they needed for labor, childcare, and household management. Fatigue was a constant companion. Yet, instead of questioning overwork or malnutrition, they learned to see the problem through the lens medical authorities provided. If weakness followed a rare bath, it confirmed the warnings they had heard. If someone fell ill shortly after washing, the explanation felt predetermined. Coincidence became evidence. The medical profession itself was far from unified, yet the loudest voices often carried the most alarming theories. Some doctors claimed that bathing shocked the system, that the sudden shift from warmth to exposure disrupted blood flow and left organs vulnerable. Others warned that too much cleanliness stripped away essential natural oils that protected the body. These explanations were presented with confidence, even when they lacked foundation. In an age before reliable scientific testing or consistent training, much of medical practice relied on tradition, conjecture, and personal belief. Victorian women, taught to view physicians as figures of authority, had little reason to doubt them. Their prescriptions shaped behavior, not through force, but through trust. This medical caution shaped the social expectations surrounding women's hygiene. A woman who bathed infrequently was not seen as negligent, but as sensible, believed to be preserving her strength and guarding herself against the unseen forces that lurked in the environment. A mother who discouraged her daughter from washing too often was considered prudent. A wife who avoided a full bath before a cold front passed was acting responsibly. These attitudes forged a culture where cleanliness was redefined not by bodily purity, but by perceived safety. Even when women felt the discomfort of sweat or dust accumulating beneath layers of fabric, they hesitated. The fear of inviting illness outweighed the desire for refreshment. In working-class households, where sickness often meant the loss of income or the collapse of family stability, the warnings held even greater power. A single day of fever could prevent a mother from completing essential tasks. A week of illness could plunge a household into deeper hardship. Under such pressures, bathing became a calculated risk that many chose not to take. The cold water available to them only reinforced the danger. If warm water could open pores and weaken the body, then cold water was seen as even more destabilizing. It chilled the skin, tightened the chest, and left the body vulnerable to drafts already feared in everyday life. Doctors had warned that bathing was not necessary for health and could indeed harm it, so avoiding it required no justification. Beyond common sense, even among wealthier families, where better living conditions offered more comfort, medical caution persisted. Ladies of higher social status listened to physicians who spoke of bodily delicacy and the importance of maintaining internal equilibrium. They followed regimens meant to preserve composure, vitality, and refinement. Overly frequent bathing was framed as indulgent, excessive, even irresponsible. Women who adhered to these guidelines were praised for their restraint. The cultural power of these ideas created a shared understanding across classes that bathing too often carried risks best avoided. The consequences of these beliefs shaped not only individual habits, but the rhythm of Victorian domestic life. Water was used sparingly. Washing focused on visible areas rather than the whole body. Cloths dipped in minimally warmed water replaced full immersion. The idea of routine bathing, common in later eras, felt alien in a society guided by warnings that framed water as a silent threat. Victorian women lived with a constant balancing act, navigating the tension between physical discomfort and the desire to protect their health. Their caution was not rooted in ignorance, but in the medical frameworks presented to them, frameworks that shaped their decisions as surely as any practical concern. As years passed, these beliefs hardened into norms that seemed too embedded to question. Stories of illness following baths circulated quietly, gaining significance with each retelling. Doctors reinforced them, newspapers hinted at them, and households lived by them. The avoidance of bathing became an accepted form of self-preservation. Victorian women learned to see water not as a pathway to cleanliness, but as a potential danger, waiting for a moment of weakness. The warnings of Victorian doctors turned simple hygiene into a matter of protecting one's strength. Their influence reached into households and shaped habits that persisted far beyond medical logic. Something else deepened this reluctance by transforming bathing into an ordeal that extended far beyond fear of illness. Layers of fabric shaped Victorian womanhood long before a single word was spoken about propriety or modesty. These garments created a world that moved with slow difficulty, a world where the simple act of dressing and undressing carried its own weight. Inside cramped rooms, lit by small windows or wavering lamplight, women confronted the quiet battle of managing clothing designed less for comfort than for structure. Heavy skirts hung from the waist, petticoats brushed against ankles, and stiff corsets pressed the torso into a narrow silhouette. Every layer served a purpose in public life. Yet, in private moments, these same layers stood as solid barriers between a woman and any hope of bathing with ease. Each garment had to be loosened, unhooked, lifted, or pulled away. And Victorian women performed this sequence day after day, with a patience shaped more by necessity than by choice. In homes without servants, a woman worked through this process alone. Fingers nipped by cold air struggled to find ties hidden beneath folds of cloth. Hooks tugged at seams, refusing to release their hold. A single misaligned fastening could delay her progress, and garments that had twisted throughout the day resisted any attempt to remove them smoothly. The effort required to undo one layer became amplified by the presence of many. In these moments, bathing did not feel like an opportunity for relief, but an obstacle course. Any warmth she had gathered from heating water slipped away as she worked to shed the weight of her clothing. The cold pressed against her skin with increasing insistence, making the process feel more like preparation for hardship than preparation for cleansing. Once the outer garments were removed, the reality of managing the remaining layers became a trial of endurance. Thick underskirts clung to the legs, trapping air that had warmed only slightly during the day. As each layer fell to the floor, the room felt larger, colder, and more unwelcoming. Women moved through this ritual, knowing that bathing would require not only undressing, but redressing, an effort that demanded equal time and strength. Washing meant confronting the entire process twice, and the thought weighed heavily on women already exhausted by domestic labor. The necessity of managing fabric shaped the rhythm of their decisions. If undressing felt burdensome, then avoiding the bath became a natural conclusion. Fabric itself added to the challenge. Woven from materials meant to maintain form, Victorian garments trapped odor and dust from the outside world. Smoke from stoves, dirt from streets, and the faint scent of sweat settled into the fibers. Yet washing these garments required more labor than washing the body. Fabrics grew heavy when wet and dried slowly in cold or damp rooms. Stains clung stubbornly to the surface, and frequent washing threatened to damage the structure of the garments. Women, therefore, found themselves in a constant compromise. Clothing that absorbed dirt and odor discouraged bathing, because wearing clean skin beneath layers that felt unclean created a discomfort that lingered throughout the day. The logic became inverted. Clothing dictated cleanliness rather than the reverse. Even for women with assistance or higher social standing, the burden persisted in different forms. Servants helped remove the elaborate layers, but this required time and privacy, two things not always available in homes governed by strict routines. The ceremony of dressing and undressing reinforced the social expectation that bathing should occur infrequently. A woman accustomed to having garments arranged for her learned to accept that removing them was an event in itself, not something undertaken lightly. Corsets shaped her posture, skirts shaped her movement, and together they shaped her habits. The more elaborate the attire, the less practical bathing became. Each garment became a reminder that maintaining appearance mattered more than maintaining ease. The rooms in which women attempted to bathe rarely offered comfort. Floors absorbed cold, mirrors fogged easily, and the air chilled the moment clothing was removed. The time needed to shed layers guaranteed exposure to these unpleasant conditions. A woman would step into the space where she intended to wash. Already half chilled into the water she had worked to warm, quickly lost its heat as it waited. If she hesitated at any point in the process, the room grew colder still. Winter intensified every step, making the layers she had just removed feel like armor she should not have abandoned. Many women found themselves pausing at this threshold, weighing the discomfort of bathing against the comfort of staying dressed. More often than not, the clothing one, redressing after a bath, became its own ordeal. Damp skin made the fabric cling in the wrong places. Stiff corsets resisted being fastened. Skirts required careful arrangement so they would fall correctly. Once the day began again, women felt the pressure of time as they struggled to restore their layered identity. They had responsibilities to attend to, children calling from other rooms, meals waiting to be prepared, and the weight of their garments reminded them of these obligations. With every fold, what should have been a moment of refreshment turned into a sequence of tasks that demanded physical and mental effort. Bathing did not simplify life, it complicated it. Through these daily interactions with fabric, Victorian women learned that their clothing shaped their sense of possibility. Layers restricted movement, restricted warmth, and restricted the very idea of ease. Bathing became something to postpone, rather than pursue, interruption to routines that clothing had already defined. Women navigated their days with a quiet understanding that garments both protected and confined them. Removing these layers felt like stepping outside the identity society expected them to maintain, and the struggle to return to that identity made bathing feel impractical even before water entered the equation. The result was a pattern that reinforced itself. Clothing discouraged bathing, and infrequent bathing made garments seem even more necessary to conceal the realities of daily life. The weight of fabric wrapped around the body became both shield and burden, shaping habits that persisted across generations. The cumbersome layers of Victorian dress turned bathing into a task that drained more energy than it restored. The garments women wore shaped their choices long before water touched the basin. A quieter influence woven into everyday life pulled them further from the habit of bathing, hinting at concerns that stretched beyond clothing. Victorian streets carried a blend of smells that settled into daily life so completely that few people questioned their presence. In crowded neighborhoods where cold smoke drifted from chimneys, where horses left their traces along every road, and where refuse accumulated near back doors, the air itself pressed a mixture of scents against the skin. Women walked through these environments wrapped in layers of fabric that absorbed everything around them. Yet the lingering odor that clung to their clothing or bodies rarely drew comment. Within households shaped by scarcity and long hours of labor, the idea of personal scent existed within a different framework than the one known today. Cleanliness was not defined by fragrance, and bodily odor was not seen as a moral failing or even a notable discomfort. It was simply part of the world, a companion to the work and weariness that filled each day. Soap remained a luxury item for many families, especially those living on narrow wages. Scented soaps carved into delicate shapes or infused with floral oils were sold behind glass in shops that most women entered only to look rather than to buy. The cost made them unattainable, except for special occasions. Even the cheaper varieties offered little relief, as they were harsh to the skin and carried only the faintest traces of fragrance that disappeared moments after washing. For women who managed households on limited means, purchasing such soap would have meant sacrificing food or other necessities. They relied instead on washing with water alone or using coarse soap that stripped the skin without removing odor entirely. In homes where dozens of other concerns competed for attention, the idea of smelling clean was overshadowed by the need to simply stay functional. Cultural norms further reinforced this acceptance. Victorian society placed more emphasis on modesty, restraint, and outward decorum than on maintaining a perfumed presence. The standards that govern dress, posture, and behavior rarely extended to expectations regarding scent. Women lived in environments where smoke, dust, and sweat were constant, and they understood that no one could escape these conditions entirely. Instead of striving for impossible purity, they adjusted their expectations. When everyone shared similar surroundings and similar sources of odor, the distinctions between one person's scent and another's faded. The notion that bodily odor required immediate correction had not yet taken root. A woman might notice the earthiness of her clothing or the warmth of her own skin beneath the layers, but she accepted these sensations as part of her identity within a demanding world. This acceptance was strengthened by the absence of strict hygiene standards. The scientific understanding of bacteria and disease was still in its early stages, and households lacked the routines that later generations would adopt as common sense. Bathing infrequently did not signal neglect, but practicality. Water was unreliable, heating it was laborious, and many doctors still warned against its frequent use. Women learned to maintain appearances through methods that concealed rather than eliminated odor. They brushed clothing, aired garments near windows, and relied on the circulation of outside air rather than cleansing the body itself. The subtle scents that rose from these layers remained unnoticed in a society where sensory overload from the urban environment dominated every street and home. In wealthier households, where perfumes and high-quality soaps were more readily available, scent became a marker of refinement, but not a universal expectation. Even these fragrances served more as adornments than as hygiene tools. Women dabbed floral waters onto handkerchiefs, or applied scented oils sparingly, not to mask something shameful, but to embellish their presence. These gestures reflected custom rather than necessity. The underlying belief that ordinary human scent was natural persisted, even among those who could afford to alter it, because high-quality fragrances were expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Their use remained limited to small touches rather than daily maintenance. They enhanced rather than redefined cleanliness. The physical realities of Victorian clothing deepened this tolerance. Layers of fabric wrapped the body so completely that scent became muted, enclosed beneath petticoats, stays, and skirts. The clothing itself absorbed odor, making it less noticeable and further delaying any perceived need for bathing. Women endured these layers day after day, knowing that no amount of washing could prevent garments from capturing the smells of the world around them. Because their clothing bore the same traces as their bodies, the distinction between clean and unclean grew blurred. Comfort, not purity, shaped their decisions. Communal life also shaped these norms. Homes were small, families were large, and privacy was limited. Women cooked over coal fires, scrubbed floors, and cared for children in rooms that held the aroma of meals, smoke, and damp clothing. In such spaces, scent belonged to the rhythm of domesticity. It reminded families of work accomplished and of the constant movement that defined their days. Efforts to eliminate bodily odor would have felt futile in environments where the air itself carried the smell of labor. As these patterns persisted, they formed a collective understanding. Victorian women did not feel alarmed when they sensed the natural odor of their own bodies. They felt no expectation to chase an ideal of cleanliness that did not exist in their world. Instead, they learned to navigate life through practical compromises. Scent became a background element shaped by environment and necessity, accepted without criticism in a society balancing on the thin line between survival and decorum. The natural scent of the body became not a flaw, but a quiet acknowledgement of endurance. The acceptance of bodily odor reflected a daily life shaped by scarcity, practicality, and cultural norms that valued restraint over fragrance. Women learned to live within these limits, adapting their habits to a world that offered few alternatives. Beneath this acceptance lay another influence, one that complicated the very notion of staying clean. The bars of soap, available to most Victorian families, carried a roughness that began long before they touched the skin. Made from cheap fats and powerful alkalis, these coarse blocks lacked the softness and balance that later generations would expect from something meant for cleansing. In markets where goods were stacked without ceremony and scents blended into a dull haze, the soap sold to the poor appeared in dull shades of gray or yellow, its surface uneven and its edges crumbly. Women purchased these bars because they cost less than the refined versions displayed behind glass in wealthier districts. Yet each use reminded them of the compromise they had been forced to make. When the soap met water, it produced a thin, sharp lather that bit at the skin rather than soothing it. Washing with it felt more like enduring a necessary discomfort than achieving a moment of relief, especially on hands already chapped from work. The soap left a burning sensation that lingered long after the water dried. It carried a harshness that crept into the small cracks along the knuckles and sank into the tender spaces between fingers. Women who attempted to wash their arms or faces with it felt the sting spread across the surface of their skin, leaving behind a tightness that made movement uncomfortable. Even when they tried to use it sparingly, the residue clung stubbornly to the body, its alkaline strength refusing to be rinsed away easily. The harshness of the soap was not simply an inconvenience, but an intrusion, one that turned the act of cleansing into an irritation that built upon the fatigue and strain of each day. The drying effect of these soaps transformed the simplest routines. After washing, the skin tightened, pulling at itself as if shrinking from the air. It became rough to the touch, sensitive to fabric, and prone to itching. Women felt this discomfort beneath their clothing, the layers rubbing against raw patches with every movement. Bathing, which should have restored some sense of comfort, instead amplified the sensation of irritation. A woman who washed her arms might spend the rest of the day feeling as though fine grains of sand clung to her skin. For those whose labor already involved exposure to cold, soot, or rough surfaces, the additional pain from the soap deepened the burden of daily life. Because the consequences were immediate, many women began to avoid using soap altogether unless necessary. They might wash their hands after a day's work, but avoid using soap on their faces, fearing the redness and burning that followed. Full bathing became even less appealing when it meant exposing larger portions of skin to the harshness of cheap soap. Parents hesitated before washing their children with it, aware that tender skin reacted even more severely. The discomfort of one bath often lingered for days, creating a cycle in which the memory of pain discouraged any attempt to cleanse. Again, instead of encouraging hygiene, the soap available to the poor created a quiet resistance to it. The expense of gentler soaps meant that only wealthier households could experience washing as something comforting. These refined soaps and carefully formulated dissolved easily in water and left the skin smooth for the poor. The contrast deepened the divide between classes. Cleanliness, already difficult because of limited water, became further stratified by access to materials that did not harm the body. Women in poorer homes adapted by using water alone or wiping themselves with damp cloths to avoid the sting of cheap soap. Bathing rituals that relied on soap became rare, reserved for moments when they had no alternative. In many neighborhoods, the harshness of soap became a shared understanding among women who gathered at communal pump sites or wells. They compared experiences, showing reddened patches on their wrists or elbows as quiet testimony to the challenges of washing. There was no sense of shame in avoiding soap, only a resignation shaped by economic constraint. The knowledge passed from woman to woman, mother to daughter, creating habits rooted not in ignorance but in self-preservation. If a bar caused pain, it was reasonable to avoid it. Cleanliness needed to fit within the realities of their bodies and their resources, not the expectations promoted in medical texts or by wealthier households. The industrial processes used to create these cheap soaps further complicated matters. Factories prioritized quantity over quality, producing blocks filled with impurities that scraped rather than smoothed the skin. Workers had no control over the composition, and consumers had no means to determine what made each bar more or less irritating. Without regulation or transparency, the poor relied on whatever the market offered, accepting the consequences because they lacked alternatives. Even when rumors spread about better soap available elsewhere, the cost made such options irrelevant. Streets shaped their habits as much as biology did, as these patterns became entrenched. The discomfort associated with soap fused into the larger reluctance to bathe that defined Victorian life. Women who had endured the burning sensation once or twice learned to anticipate it and adjusted their routines accordingly. The idea of washing became tied to the idea of enduring unnecessary pain in a world where daily survival already required tolerance for hardship. Adding another source of discomfort felt unreasonable. Instead of bathing, women focused on managing appearance through clothing and small surface cleaning practices that required less exposure to the sting of soap. Over time, the avoidance of bathing felt not like a flaw, but like a practical response to the tools available. The harshness of cheap soap shaped not only hygiene, but also the emotional relationship women had with cleanliness. They understood that the materials meant to help them were the same materials that harmed them. Their avoidance was an act of self-protection, a way of preserving what little comfort their environment afforded. In this tension between desire and possibility, bathing receded from daily life and became an occasional necessity rather than a routine. The sting of cheap soap reinforced a world where washing felt like punishment instead of relief. The pain it caused shaped habits and hardened reluctance, leaving women with few reasons to endure the discomfort again. Pressures beyond physical irritation soon played their own role in pushing bathing even further from daily life. Winter in Victorian towns arrived with a severity that pressed itself into every corner of daily life, turning the simplest movements into negotiations with cold that never seemed to lift. Houses built from thin timber or aging brick held little warmth, and the air inside often felt no gentler than the air outside. Women woke each morning to rooms where their breath drifted visibly in front of them, faint cloud signaling the chill that lay ahead in such conditions. The idea of bathing did not resemble a refreshing ritual, but a confrontation with forces that could harm the body more quickly than dirt ever could. Water gathered from wells or pumps grew icy by the time it reached the basin, and even the act of pouring it sent a sting through the hands that carried it. Washing became an ordeal that began with endurance rather than intention. Cold water tightened the skin instantly, leaving behind a numbness that spread across the arms, chest, and back with alarming speed. Women who attempted to wash more than their hands felt the cold settle into their bones, stiffening muscles until movement became slow and heavy. The chill made breathing shallow, and the shock of it sent a tremor through the body before a woman could even begin to cleanse herself. Physicians of the era, already wary of frequent bathing, warned that such exposure invited illness. Their cautions echoed through neighborhoods where fever, cough, and weakness were common visitors. A single chill could become a persistent ailment, and mothers feared the possibility of turning a moment of washing into days or weeks of sickness. In homes where each member's strength contributed to survival, the risk felt far too large to ignore. The absence of reliable heating deepened these fears. Fires burned unevenly, consuming coal or wood faster than families could afford to replenish them. Women tended their stoves carefully, rationing fuel so that cooking and warmth competed for priority. A bath required heat not only for the water but for the room itself, and few families had enough resources to warm both. Even when the stove glowed red, its reach seldom extended beyond a small radius. A woman stepping away from that circle of warmth felt the cold grip her immediately. Rooms meant for washing transformed into pockets of icy air, their floors made colder by stone or packed earth that offered no insulation. Each contact with the ground sent another jolt upward through the feet and legs. Drafts slipped through cracks in window panes and beneath door frames, invisible but relentless. A cloth hung over a window did little to stop the intrusion. Women, undressing for a bath, felt these drafts swirl around them, sharpening the cold and making the exposure unbearable. The contrast between warm layers of clothing and the chill of undressed skin made the body recoil, standing in that state of vulnerability. Surrounded by cold that seeped into every surface, women sensed how quickly their strength could falter. Washing more than a few areas became an unnecessary gamble, one that could upset the fragile balance of health they worked so hard to maintain. These dangers stamped themselves into memory. Families recalled neighbors who had fallen ill after bathing during winter. Stories passed quietly from household to household. Whether these accounts were entirely accurate mattered less than the impression they left. The association between cold water and illness grew stronger each season, reinforced by personal experiences and the visible suffering of others. Women learned to equate warmth with survival and bathing with vulnerability. They made practical choices shaped by caution rather than neglect, and those choices became habits ingrained in the rhythm of winter life. Even attempts to warm the water carried their own challenges. A pot placed on the stove could heat only a small amount, and carrying it to the washing area allowed the chill to reclaim it almost immediately. Adding more water required additional fuel, more time, and more exposure to cold air. The process stretched into a sequence of actions that demanded physical endurance while offering little reward. By the time the bath was ready, the room was colder than before, and the water had lost its warmth before it could bring comfort. Women often abandoned the idea altogether, choosing instead to remain dressed and conserve their strength. Children added another layer of complexity. Mothers feared allowing them to bathe during winter, worried that their smaller bodies could not withstand the shock. Instead, they wiped faces and hands quickly, wrapping children in blankets as soon as the cloth left their skin. The avoidance of full bathing became an act of protection rather than neglect. In families where illness had already taken a toll, the decision felt even more justified. Women internalized these fears until winter bathing seemed not only uncomfortable, but reckless. The relationship between cold and vulnerability shaped Victorian attitudes toward health. Warmth became a precious resource, conserved whenever possible. Clothing served as insulation not only against the weather, but against perceived threats to the body's defenses. Removing layers disrupted that protection. Bathing required abandoning the shield the clothing provided, and, in winter, the loss of that barrier felt too dangerous to risk. Women approached the idea of washing with caution, shaped by instinct, memory, and necessity. The environment dictated their habits as forcefully as any societal expectation. As winter deepened each year, the reluctance to bathe solidified into certainty. The body's natural warmth felt fragile, a flame that needed shielding. Any practice that risked extinguishing that warmth seemed impractical. Bathing faded into the background of daily routines, replaced by surface cleaning and layers of fabric that hid the traces of daily labor. Women accepted these adjustments as part of surviving the season, making choices that balanced comfort, health, and practicality. The harsh winters turned bathing into a threat rather than a comfort, shaping decisions that prioritized survival over cleanliness. Cold rooms, icy water, and constant drafts made washing feel like a risk no one could justify. Within this atmosphere of fear and restraint, deeper concerns about privacy further discouraged the idea of bathing at all. Victorian society wrapped women in expectations that extended far beyond the fabric of their clothing, shaping not only how they behaved in public, but how they moved within the quiet corners of their own homes. Modesty governed the rhythm of daily life, rooted in a belief that the female body should remain concealed as completely as possible. A woman's worth was measured through restraint, silence, and careful control of how she occupied space. These expectations seeped into every aspect of personal care, turning the act of bathing into something weighted with caution and shame. Even in moments when a woman stood alone behind a closed door, the idea of removing her clothing carried an unease that echoed the voices of parents, peers, and preachers who had taught her to guard her body from exposure. Within cramped homes, shared by families of multiple generations, privacy was not easily found. Doors lacked locks or swung loosely on hinges, offering little separation from the activity beyond them. A woman preparing to undress for even a partial wash listened carefully for footsteps in the hallway or voices approaching from other rooms. The simple act of loosening a corset felt daring in a world where showing an ankle could draw commentary. Removing layers of clothing, even when alone, carried an emotional burden formed not from vanity, but from a lifetime of being told that her body should remain hidden. Bathing demanded exposure, and exposure clashed with the values that shaped her identity. In wealthier homes, the architecture provided more space, but not more freedom. Etiquette manuals instructed women to maintain modesty at all times, emphasizing the vulnerability associated with undress. A lady might have a designated dressing room, yet she still approached bathing with the same guardedness instilled since childhood. Servants assisted with dressing, but rarely with bathing, as the latter required a level of intimacy considered inappropriate. Even married women hesitated to bathe while their husbands were nearby, aware that undressing for reasons unrelated to marital duty stepped beyond accepted norms. The bath became a concealed ritual carried out quietly and without acknowledgement. Because bathing required such vulnerability, women learned to associate it with risk and discomfort. They chose times when households were calm or when other members were away, minimizing chances of interruption. Even then, the fear of being accidentally seen pressed into their thoughts, urging them to move quickly and avoid fully uncovering themselves unless necessary. Washing became a sequence of guarded motions, small areas of the body cleaned in isolation rather than through immersive ease. A basin of water replaced a tub, a cloth replaced immersion, and the ritual of bathing shrank in scale to protect a woman's sense of propriety. Cultural expectations deepened this hesitation. Religious teachings emphasized purity, but framed the body as a vessel prone to moral danger. Women were encouraged to treat physical form with suspicion, focusing instead on spiritual restraint. In this environment, bathing represented a moment when the physical demanded attention, disrupting the preferred narrative of invisibility. The body became undeniable when stripped of fabric, and this awareness unsettled women taught to minimize their presence. The act of bathing felt intimate in a way that conflicted with social ideals, and many women internalized this tension until avoidance seemed the simplest resolution. Stories whispered among women reinforced these attitudes. Incidents of accidental exposure, even within private homes, circulated with an air of caution. A door opening unexpectedly, a relative entering without knocking, a neighbor glimpsing through an uncurtained window. Each account carried the weight of embarrassment that lingered far longer than physical discomfort. These stories reminded women that privacy could be breached easily, and the anxiety of such moments overshadowed the practical need for bathing. Shame became a powerful deterrent, shaping habits more forcefully than water scarcity or cold rooms ever could. The architecture of Victorian homes offered little reassurance. Many houses lacked dedicated bathroom spaces, forcing women to wash in multi-purposed rooms such as kitchens or bedrooms. These areas, constantly in use, provided no sense of sanctuary. A woman bathing behind a makeshift screen or a hung blanket felt exposed even when unaware that the barrier was symbolic rather than secure. She listened for the creak of floorboards, the rattle of a doorknob, and the rustle of fabric that signaled someone approaching. The thin divide between privacy and intrusion transformed bathing into an activity that demanded vigilance rather than relaxation. Even when physical privacy existed, internalized expectations persisted. Women felt obligated to maintain modest posture even when alone and avoided looking directly at their own bodies. The act of bathing forced them to confront themselves in a way that contradicted a cultural script designed to separate women from their physicality. This discomfort layered itself onto the practical challenges of bathing, creating an emotional barrier that grew stronger with each passing year. The less frequently women bathed, the more daunting the act became, reinforcing a cycle that redefined cleanliness through concealment rather than through washing. Within this framework, bathing shifted from a hygienic necessity to a morally charged act, requiring careful timing and emotional preparation. Women learned to navigate their routines with caution, finding alternatives that allowed them to maintain modesty. Wiping small areas of the body or limiting washing to the face and hands aligned more comfortably with societal expectations. These practices preserved the illusion of propriety without risking the vulnerability associated with full undress. Over time, the idea of private bathing transformed from a personal choice into an act that felt transgressive, something to be hidden as much for emotional preservation as for reputation. The pressure to remain modest shaped bathing into an act shadowed by caution, turning privacy into a fragile resource that few women possessed. The emotional weight of exposure discouraged even the simplest forms of washing. Yet this reluctance grew stronger when another concern entered the household, one that challenged not only modesty, but the very safety of the bathing space itself. Bathing in Victorian homes unfolded within spaces that offered far more uncertainty than comfort, shaped by architecture that had never been designed with privacy in mind. Rooms doubled and tripled in function, leaving little distinction between places for work, rest, and personal care. A woman preparing to wash might find herself standing in a corner of the kitchen, beside the stove where meals simmered, or in a bedroom shared with children who stirred unpredictably in their sleep. In many households, the area used for washing was no more than a narrow section of floor near a basin exposed to drafts and footsteps. The physical environment carried a sense of vulnerability that settled heavily on any woman attempting to undress long enough to cleanse herself. She lived within walls that separated her from the outside world, yet offered little separation from the life unfolding within her own home. The absence of dedicated bathing rooms meant that spaces intended for bodily care blended uneasily with spaces intended for household tasks. Toilets, when present at all, sat near kitchens or bedrooms, sometimes within arm's reach of the only wash basin available. Moisture, odor, and noise drifted through these areas without restraint. A woman who knelt beside a small tub placed on the floor could easily hear someone approaching, but the warning did little to diminish the anxiety of being discovered mid-wash. Doors lightweight and poorly fitted, rattled with every shift in the air. Their locks, when they existed, were flimsy metal latches that failed as often as they held. Even the sound of the latch sliding into place brought little reassurance, for a strong push or an accidental tug could render the barrier useless. Privacy became not a guarantee, but a hope in cramped tenements where families lived only a few feet apart. Walls did little to block sound or movement. Children wandered freely, relatives passed through rooms without knocking, and neighbors entered. Homes with a casual familiarity, born of necessity. A woman attempting to bathe in such an environment learned to remain tense, her ears attuned to every creak of the floorboards. She washed quickly, not because of the cold or the limited water, but because of the looming possibility that someone might appear before she had time to conceal herself. The shame of being unexpectedly seen outweighed the discomfort of incomplete washing, and many women chose to avoid bathing altogether rather than endure the fear that accompanied it. Even in Wealthier homes, where larger rooms and thicker doors offered some degree of separation, the sense of intrusion persisted. Servants moved throughout the house, performing their duties, often without warning or announcement. A lady could find herself interrupted at any moment, her privacy contingent on timing and luck rather than certainty. In this landscape of porous boundaries and constant motion, the simple act of bathing became fraught with anticipation and anxiety, not because women did not desire cleanliness, but because the conditions in which they lived made it feel like a risk few could afford to take. Victorian women often requested privacy. Yet the rhythms of household labor did not easily adjust to moments when she needed to wash. Doors left ajar for ventilation created new vulnerabilities, allowing shadows or voices to slip in unexpectedly. The architecture was not designed to support solitude. It was designed to support constant activity. In such homes, bathing felt less like a personal ritual and more like a negotiation with the expectations and movements of everyone else. Night offered little relief. Candles flickered against thin curtains, casting silhouettes that revealed more than a woman wished to show. The light created outlines along door frames that betrayed movement outside, unsettling her even if no one truly approached. Washing by candlelight intensified the feeling of exposure, transforming the bathing space into a stage where the slightest sound could signal an unwanted audience. Women who attempted to bathe after dark often moved silently, pausing at every noise, listening for voices or footsteps. The quiet became suffocating, and the sense of being watched lingered long after. The room returned to stillness. These fears were not unfounded. Stories circulated among households about women who were accidentally exposed during washing, tales passed with sympathy and caution. A visitor entering the wrong room, a sibling forgetting to knock, a door blown open by wind. Each incident carried emotional weight that lingered for years. Women who experienced such moments lived with renewed reluctance, their bodies remembering the shock of intrusion long after the event. The possibility of repetition reshaped their habits, reducing full bathing to rare occasions and reinforcing the belief that modesty required limiting exposure whenever possible. The lack of secure bathing spaces also influenced how women taught their daughters to behave. Mothers, aware of the risks and discomfort they faced, instructed girls to wash only small areas at a time and to keep themselves covered as much as possible. These lessons were passed down with the same seriousness reserved for warnings about illness or injury. A girl learned early that the home did not protect her completely, that privacy was fragile, and that her body should be guarded even within familiar walls. As she grew older, these teachings became instinctual, shaping her interactions with water, with clothing, and with the spaces she occupied. In households where space was limited and interruptions constant, the idea of bathing shifted into an activity that felt unnecessary compared to the emotional strain it imposed. Women chose predictability over vulnerability, routine over risk. They washed their hands and faces, cleaned under their arms, and refreshed their garments all without unraveling the layers that concealed them. This modified approach aligned with the expectations of their society, which valued restraint over display. In such a world, bathing did not fail because women lacked hygiene. It failed because the spaces meant to support it offered too many opportunities for exposure. As these patterns persisted, the notion of full bathing faded from daily life. Women accepted the fragility of their environments and adjusted their habits accordingly. In the tension between bodily care and personal safety, safety prevailed. The uncertainty of bathing spaces turned washing into a moment shadowed by fear, shaping habits around the need to protect privacy at all costs. Each room carried potential for intrusion, leaving women dependent on smaller, safer rituals of cleanliness. Yet the physical environment posed more than emotional risks. Dirt and contamination within the water itself brought dangers that reshaped bathing in deeper ways. For poor Victorian families living in narrow terraces or crowded tenements, the home offered little separation between public life and private needs. Rooms served multiple purposes, shifting throughout the day to accommodate work, eating, sleeping, and household chores. In such limited spaces, the concept of a dedicated bathing room existed only in the imagination. Women learned early that any attempt to wash would unfold within the same corners used for stirring pots, mending clothes, or comforting restless children. The absence of a private room did not simply inconvenience the act of bathing, it reshaped it entirely, stripping it of comfort and turning it into something closer to a logistical challenge than a moment of care. The basin used for washing was often the same one used for scrubbing vegetables or rinsing laundry. Its metal surface, dented from years of use, bore the marks of constant household labor. Families shared this single vessel because they had no alternative, filling it with water that cooled the moment it touched the air. A woman attempting to wash in such a basin understood that she would not be the only one using it. Children washed their hands in it after playing in the alleys. Men rinsed their faces in it after hours of soot-filled labor. By evening, the water it held felt less like a cleansing tool and more like a tired container for the traces of everyone's day. Bathing with it meant entering a communal space rather than a private ritual. Reminder that cleanliness was shaped by necessity rather than personal preference. For many households, the only available bathing area existed just outside the back door or beside the stove. Washing in the yard exposed women to the unpredictable air that swept through narrow lanes. Neighbors walking past could hear water splashing or glimpse movement through gaps in fences that leaned at uncertain angles. The yard, hard-packed and uneven, offered no shelter except perhaps the shadow cast by the house itself. Bathing here demanded constant vigilance. Women moved quickly, glancing toward windows or doors, always aware that their privacy depended on the hope that others would stay occupied indoors. The slightest noise from a nearby house stirred anxiety, reminding them that they bathed within a space never meant to protect them. Bathing inside near the kitchen provided no real improvement. The stove created a small pocket of warmth, but the room beyond it remained cold. Children wandered in and out, chasing each other around furniture or tugging at their mother's skirt. Pots boiled loudly, filling the space with steam that mingled with the dampness of wash water. The air grew heavy, yet the warmth never extended far enough to create comfort. A woman undressing here felt exposed, not only physically but emotionally, aware that anyone could enter the room at any moment. The line between routine tasks and private care dissolved entirely, turning bathing into an awkward interruption to the household rhythm. Conditions in these homes made bathing feel burdensome, not because women disliked cleanliness, but because the environment offered no support for it. Floors absorbed cold, walls trapped moisture, windows fogged easily, adding a sense of confinement rather than solitude. Water spilled onto surfaces already worn from use, soaking into cracks or evaporating into air thick with the smell of cooking and damp clothing. The room felt neither hygienic nor restful. When a woman stepped away from the basin after washing, the space she left behind carried no sense of completion. It remained cluttered, unsettled, marked by the presence of too many tasks competing for the same few feet of floor. The emotional weight of these surroundings deepened the reluctance to bathe. A woman who worked from dawn until nightfall had little energy left to transform an ordinary room into a bathing space. Moving basins, heating water, clearing the floor, guarding her privacy, and then redressing demanded a concentration of effort that felt disproportionate to the relief it provided, especially when the home already felt strained under the pressure of too many bodies and too few resources. The thought of adding bathing to the evening routine seemed almost unreasonable. Women learned to limit full washing to the rare times when necessity demanded it, choosing instead to wipe small areas of the body and rely on clothing to conceal whatever the wash had failed to remove. The shared nature of bathing strengthened these habits. A family of many members relied on the same basin, the same small space, and the same brief windows of privacy. Water warmed for one person cooled before another could use it. The arrangement created tension rather than ease. Bathing became an activity narrowed by time and shaped by communal limitations. In such an environment, the frequency of washing had less to do with personal preference and more to do with survival within a space not built to support it. Over time, the poor grew accustomed to these constraints. The lack of a bathing room was not a temporary inconvenience, but a defining feature of life. Women adjusted their routines, making peace with the idea that full bathing belonged to those whose homes held more rooms and more warmth. In their own dwellings where every inch of space carried the weight of multiple purposes, bathing became a guest that visited only when circumstances allowed. Cleanliness unfolded in fragments, shaped by the boundaries of the home itself. The absence of a private bathing room transformed hygiene into a fragmented, improvised act shaped by space and circumstance. Crowded homes and shared basins discouraged immersion in water altogether. As these limitations deepened, another belief took hold, altering not just where women bathed, but how they understood the very meaning of cleanliness. Victorian households shaped their routines around compromises that balanced health, modesty, and the limited resources available to them. And within this delicate system, the idea of wiping the body gradually replaced the act of bathing itself. Women learned to approach cleanliness not through immersion, but through careful gestures that required little water, little exposure, and little disruption to the fragile warmth of the home. A warmed cloth held between the hands became a familiar tool, its dampness controlled so it never chilled the skin. With it, women traced small paths along the face, neck, and arms, removing the most visible signs of the day while avoiding the shock that full washing inevitably brought. These motions fit seamlessly into the rhythm of domestic work, requiring neither the rearrangement of rooms nor the vulnerability of undressing fully. Cleanliness became a matter of precision rather than thoroughness, shaped by practicality more than desire. The habit formed naturally within households where warmth was scarce and cold air pressed into every corner. A cloth warmed near the stove offered a fleeting sense of comforter, gentle heat that did not evaporate as quickly as that of a basin. Filled with water, women moved the cloth over their bodies with deliberate care, mindful that the warmth faded quickly and needed to be returned to the stove between passes. The smallness of the act provided reassurance. They remained clothed, or partially clothed, shielded from drafts that threatened to sap their strength. The warmth of the cloth protected them from the chill that lingered on floors, in walls, and within the very air they breathed. In this environment, wiping felt protective, while bathing felt dangerous. This approach to hygiene aligned closely with prevailing beliefs about health. Many women feared that soaking the body, especially in cold months, invited illness. Wiping allowed them to remove sweat, surface dirt, and the residue of daily labor without risking the sudden loss of body heat that doctors warned against. They worked quickly, covering exposed skin only briefly before returning layers of clothing to preserve warmth. The cloth served both practical and emotional roles, reinforcing the sense that cleanliness could be achieved without stepping into the dangers associated with bathing. It allowed them to maintain a feeling of control and continuity within a world full of unpredictable discomforts. Scented waters and herbal mixtures added another dimension to this adapted form of cleanliness, made from lavender, rose, or mint. These mild solutions did little to cleanse the skin but softened odor and created the sensation of freshness. Women dabbed these scented liquids onto cloths or directly onto their skin, letting the fragrance settle lightly beneath their clothing. These scents carried none of the harshness of cheap soap and offered a gentle alternative that felt safe. They masked the natural odor that lingered beneath layers of fabric and provided a sense of composure that bathing seldom delivered. The use of such fragrances became an art of subtlety, a way to maintain dignity without confronting the discomfort of a full wash. In this setting, wiping the body came to represent a refined balance between caution and necessity. Women believed the cloth removed what truly mattered, leaving behind enough natural oils to protect the skin and maintain the body's equilibrium. They did not view this method as inferior. Rather, it felt sensible, measured, and aligned with the realities they faced. Household routines reinforced this belief. After cooking or tending to children, a woman could refresh herself quickly. After sweeping floors or stoking the fire, she could wipe away the residue of her labor without preparing an entire bathing space. The cloth acted as a companion that adapted to the unpredictability of the home. Even within wealthier households where access to water was more reliable, many women adopted similar habits. Servants could prepare warm cloths more quickly than a full bath, and modesty remained a concern regardless of class. A lady could wipe her hands and face discreetly between social engagements without enduring the trouble of undressing or preparing a washing room. The ritual became associated with grace and restraint rather than with compromise. Manuals on genteel behavior praised the use of scented cloths to maintain freshness. reinforcing the idea that wiping was not only practical but elegant. This approach shaped how cleanliness itself was understood. Instead of viewing the body as something requiring immersion, women saw it as something requiring maintenance tended to through careful touches rather than thorough washing. They judged cleanliness by appearance, scent, and comfort rather than by the complete removal of dirt. Their habits reflected the world. They inhabited a world where cold rooms, contaminated water, and inadequate privacy dictated the boundaries of what was possible. Wiping offered a solution that respected these limits without abandoning the desire to feel presentable. Over generations, this belief hardened into tradition. Daughters learned from their mothers that a warm cloth provided all the cleansing needed for daily life. They observed how women balanced modesty, health, and practicality through this method, and they adopted it without question. Bathing became an occasional act, reserved for moments when necessity outweighed discomfort. Daily cleanliness rested in the cloth, the fragrance, and the rituals performed quietly within the home. In the end, wiping the body was less a rejection of bathing than a reinterpretation of it. Women adapted their routines to the realities that shaped their lives, finding a method that offered comfort, safety, and a sense of control. The belief that wiping provided sufficient cleanliness grew from a world constrained by cold, scarcity, and modesty, reshaping hygiene into a ritual of small, careful gestures. These habits made sense within their environment. Yet another obstacle emerged that further discouraged bathing by turning contamination into a more immediate threat. For Victorian women, hair was not merely a feature of appearance, but a defining element of identity cultivated with patience and protected with unwavering care. Long hair symbolized virtue, femininity, and discipline. Yet the very length that society admired imposed heavy burdens on daily life. Washing it required a commitment of time and effort that few households could accommodate. Even the thought of preparing for such a task introduced a sense of hesitation. Women learned quickly that tending to their hair meant entering a process that unfolded slowly, governed by damp air, limited heat, and the fragile balance of staying warm within cold, draft-filled homes. Water transformed their hair into something heavy and uncooperative, turning what might seem like a small act of grooming into a ritual that consumed entire hours. Grooming the hair began with unraveling the elaborate styles worn throughout the day. Pins, ribbons, and tightly coiled sections had to be removed carefully, strand by strand. Once loosened, the hair fell in thick waves or ropes, often reaching past the waist. Its sheer volume made washing far more complicated than tending to shorter hair. Women knelt beside basins or leaned over tubs, dipping sections into the water and working soap through the strands with deliberate repetition. The weight of wet hair strained their necks and shoulders, slowing their movements and deepening their exhaustion. What began as an attempt at cleanliness quickly became a taxing physical effort that left them shivering despite any warmth the home provided. Drying the hair presented even greater challenges. Victorian homes retained little heat, and fires warmed only the spaces nearest the stove. The moment a woman lifted her hair from the water, cold air swept across her damp scalp, drawing out warmth with uncomfortable speed. She wrapped her hair in cloths, but the fabric absorbed moisture quickly and became heavy against her skin. The weight of these wrappings strained her posture, leaving her unable to move freely until the worst of the dampness had lifted. Even when positioned near the stove, warmth could not penetrate the thick layers of cloth or the dense volume of hair beneath. Time stretched slowly, and progress came in small increments that demanded patience and stillness. The risk of illness shaped these routines more heavily than inconvenience alone. Women lived in homes where drafts slipped through window frames and floorboards without resistance. Dampness lingered in the air, settling into fabrics and walls. In such an environment, wet hair represented genuine danger. Medical beliefs of the era reinforced this fear, warning that exposure to cold with damp hair could weaken the body or usher in illness. Mothers repeated these warnings to their daughters, teaching them that washing their hair too often brought unnecessary risk. The fear became ingrained, guiding decisions long after the water had cooled and the wrappings had grown heavy. Avoidance became a sign of prudence rather than neglect. The time required for hair to dry extended the difficulty. Hours passed before the hair felt even remotely light again. On damp days, when fog hovered close to the ground or rain pressed against window panes, drying could take most of the day. Women hesitated to engage in household work with wet hair, aware that bending forward or lifting heavy objects created additional discomfort. They remained confined near the stove or in patches of weak sunlight, hoping the environment would cooperate. The demands of daily life rarely allowed for such stillness. Children needed attention, meals needed preparation, laundry needed tending. The immobility required for drying hair did not align with these responsibilities. Faced with the conflict, women chose to prioritize their families and their health over the discomfort of prolonged grooming. Because of these challenges, washing the hair became an infrequent ritual. Women brushed their hair thoroughly each day, distributing natural oils from scalp to ends to maintain shine and prevent tangling. This method served not only as a form of grooming, but as a substitute for washing. Brushing allowed them to manage their hair without exposing themselves to cold or sacrificing hours of their day. It became a comforting habit, one that preserved the hair's strength and appearance while avoiding the risks and exhaustion associated with washing. The hairbrush held a central place in household routines, its use far more common than water, even in wealthier homes where fires burned more steadily and basins were larger. The difficulties remained. Long hair dried slowly regardless of class, and the threat of cold was not eliminated by improved service. Ladies maintained strict schedules for washing their hair, often performing the ritual only every few weeks. Servants assisted with drying by holding warm cloths or tending the fire, but the process still demanded extended periods of inactivity. The labor required for even the most privileged women underscored just how impractical frequent washing truly was. Across all classes, women internalized the belief that washing the hair too often was neither wise nor necessary. The length of their hair celebrated by society created conditions that made bathing more complicated and more dangerous. The physical burden of wet hair, combined with a cold that permeated their homes, established boundaries that shaped their understanding of hygiene. Washing the body already required significant effort, but washing the hair magnified every challenge. Avoidance became routine not through neglect, but through the practical understanding that their environment did not support such demands. Over time, these habits solidified into expectations. A woman with long, carefully maintained hair was admired even if she rarely washed it. Cleanliness became associated with appearance rather than frequency of washing, and the rituals that supported that appearance became the foundation of daily grooming. The sheer weight and slow drying of long, squarian hair turned washing into a task too demanding for daily life, reinforcing habits shaped by cold rooms and constant risk of illness. These challenges blurred the line between practicality and necessity. Yet another belief tightened its hold over women's routines, suggesting that too much bathing could endanger more than just comfort. Victorian society measured a woman's worth not only through her manners and restraint, but also through the way she occupied her own body. Cleanliness itself was not rejected. The pursuit of it, beyond a modest threshold, stirred suspicion. Women learned that bathing too frequently invited whispers, as if tending too carefully to the body revealed an indulgence that bordered on vanity. In communities where resources were limited and most families lived under constant pressure to stretch their means, a woman who appeared freshly washed more often than her neighbors risked drawing unwanted commentary. Cleanliness became entangled with moral judgment shaped by a belief that excess attention to the body suggested a character too concerned with luxury. Even those who desired the comfort of bathing learned to hesitate, aware that each additional wash might be interpreted through a lens neither fair nor forgiving. These attitudes grew from economic realities as much as cultural ones. In many working households, heating water required time, fuel, and labor. A woman who bathed more frequently than others seemed to be using resources that her neighbors considered precious. The act of bathing, when repeated often, implied that she could afford such indulgency. This implication made others uneasy. Gossip took root easily in environments where daily life unfolded side by side, where every sound passed through thin walls, and every routine became visible to those living only a few steps away. A woman carrying warm water to her room too often or airing garments too frequently near the fire became a subject of speculation. Cleanliness no longer appeared as an unnecessary display. Rumors spread quickly through markets, doorsteps, and churchyards. Women who bathed regularly found themselves spoken about in tones of skepticism, accused of seeking admiration or trying to distinguish themselves from others. Cleanliness, rather than suggesting discipline, was twisted into a sign of ostentation. Even her attempts to maintain modesty could not prevent these judgments. The very act of caring for her body more often than social norms allowed appeared to signal that she valued appearance over humility. Such interpretations carried weight in a society that treated humility as a virtue and excess as a threat to moral order. In wealthier circles, the criticism took a different form but carried the same undertones. A lady who bathed too frequently risked being perceived as fragile, idle, or overly preoccupied with her appearance. Manuals on propriety warned against unnecessary bathing, suggesting that it softened the constitution or reflected an improper focus on the physical servants. Observed their employers closely, and their impressions filtered through households and communities shaping reputation in subtle ways. The desire to remain respectable overshadowed personal comfort, and even those with the means to bathe more often approached the act with careful restraint. The connection between bathing and vanity extended beyond frequency. Women who smelled of scented soap or wore garments that suggested recent washing risked being seen as seeking admiration. Their efforts, however simple, became interpreted as displays. Even the faint fragrance of lavender could inspire comments about extravagance. For many women, such remarks cut deeply, undermining the balance they tried to maintain between cleanliness and social acceptance. The pressure to appear humble at all times pressed heavily upon them, shaping routines more forcefully than any practical challenge. The fear of judgment encouraged secrecy. Women who wished to bathe occasionally did so, quietly choosing times when others were unlikely to notice. They drew curtains tightly, carried water discreetly, and avoided hanging freshly washed undergarments where they could be seen. Bathing became not only an act of privacy, but one of concealment, a measure taken to protect themselves from misinterpretation. In this atmosphere, even reasonable attention to hygiene felt risky. Their bodies remained caught between the need for care and the fear of what such care might suggest. These social pressures also shaped conversations between women. Mothers warned their daughters not to appear too clean or too polished, urging them to maintain a level of simplicity that aligned with accepted norms. Older relatives shared stories of women whose reputations suffered because they were believed to be too attentive to their appearance. These warnings carried authority, rooted in lived experience and reinforced through collective memory. Young women absorbed these lessons, shaping their habits long before they had to confront such judgments themselves. In time, the suspicion toward frequent bathing solidified into expectation. A woman who bathed sparingly was seen as sensible, grounded, and modest. Her choices aligned with the rhythm of her community and the values of her society. Cleanliness took on a symbolic dimension, not simply reflecting care for the body, but demonstrating the restraint expected of a respectable woman. To conform became internalized, guiding women's decisions even in the absence of external judgment. The result was a culture in which discomfort was preferred over the risk of appearing indulgent. Women adapted their routines to avoid the consequences of being perceived as too concerned with their bodies. Bathing remained something reserved for necessity, rather than comfort, shaped by the belief that modesty required limiting attention to the physical dot in a world governed by restraint. Even the desire for cleanliness became something to be moderated. The fear of appearing extravagant turned bathing into a gesture weighed down by judgment, compelling women to balance cleanliness against reputation. Their routines reflected not neglect, but caution, shaped by the expectations of those around them. Yet deeper discomfort lay ahead. For the very tools meant to cleanse the body introduced dangers that reached far beyond vanity. Many Victorian women approached the act of bathing with an unease that reached deeper than modesty or cold rooms shaped. Instead, by the lingering shadows of medical rituals they had witnessed throughout their lives, washing the body at home often resembled the procedures carried out in places associated with illness, childbirth, and recovery. The basins, metal pitchers, cloths, and narrow wooden tubs found in ordinary households mirrored the equipment nurses used in hospitals, where patients were washed not for comfort, but out of necessity. This resemblance was not lost on the women, who encountered it daily. Each object carried traces of another world, one defined by weakness rather than routine, and these associations settled heavily over the domestic environment within their own homes. Women frequently saw full body washing, performed only during moments of sickness. When a family member suffered from fever or injury, the household gathered warm water, unfolded cloths, and created a makeshift treatment area around the bed. The atmosphere in these moments was solemn. The water was heated, not to refresh, but to soothe, to provide comfort in circumstances that often felt desperate. Children observed quietly from doorways, absorbing the connection between bathing and frailty. Years later, as adults, these memories resurfaced whenever they prepared their own basins. The steam rising from warm water looked the same, the folded cloths carried the same stillness, and the tub set beside a bed evoked the same mixture of fear and concern. Bathing no longer belonged solely to the realm of hygiene, but shared space with memories of illness. Childbirth deepened this association. Further, many women were washed before labor to prepare the body, and again after delivery, when exhaustion made movement difficult. These baths were performed under dim lighting, with midwives guiding each step, the air thick with anticipation and anxiety. The sensation of water on the skin during such a moment left a lasting imprint. Long after giving birth, women remembered the quiet urgency of those baths, the way hands moved with caution, and the vulnerability that accompanied each motion. These experiences shaped how they felt about washing, even when no crisis was present. Bathing became entwined with one of the most physically demanding and emotionally charged events in a woman's life. Outside the home, hospitals reinforced this connection even more firmly. Victorian medical facilities carried reputations marked by infection, sorrow, and outcomes no one could predict. When women visited sick relatives or entered hospitals themselves, they often saw the same tools and motions used for washing patients. Metal basins clanged softly against floors. Cloths were wrung with deliberate care, and water cooled quickly in rooms with little heat. These details carved themselves into memory. Returning home, a woman washing her hands or preparing a cloth to wipe her skin might suddenly recall the stark quiet of hospital corridors. The resemblance between the two environments made bathing feel clinical rather than comforting. This emotional weight shifted how bathing was understood. Many women began to avoid washing, not because they disliked cleanliness, but because washing stirred memories they preferred not to revisit. The basin reminded them of sickbeds. The tub resembled the one used during recovery. The cloth felt like the one pressed against a fevered forehead. The boundary between hygiene and medical care dissolved, leaving the act of bathing colored by fear. Avoidance felt protective, a way to preserve emotional distance from events that had shaken them deeply. Tools traditionally used for bathing carried echoes of suffering, turning what should have been a private comfort into a silent confrontation with vulnerability. Contributed to this discomfort. The cool metal of a pitcher resembled instruments associated with procedures best forgotten. The sound of water poured into a basin evoked the beginning of a treatment rather than a moment of care. Even soap, sharper in scent during that era, carried tones reminiscent of hospitals. These sensory echoes shaped women's reactions more powerfully than logic could counter. The home meant to be a refuge, became a place where small reminders of vulnerability lingered in corners where basins sat and cloths dried. Cultural conversation sustained these beliefs. Stories passed among women described illness worsening after a bath, or a patient's final cleansing being performed with the same tools used at home. Conversations about childbirth emphasized the solemnity of the ritual washing that preceded it. Details shared over fences or in markets grew into collective memory. Each story reinforced the idea that bathing belonged to moments of fragility, not to the ordinary rhythm of life. Women who already struggled with cold rooms, limited privacy, or scarce water now carried the additional burden of emotional reluctance. Because of this atmosphere, many adapted their routines away from immersion. Wiping the body with warm cloths felt gentler and lacked the stark associations tied to basins filled with water. This method protected women from both cold drafts and uneasy memories. It offered a controlled, modest approach to hygiene, one that did not resemble the procedures seen in hospitals or childbirth chambers. Wiping became a comforting ritual, while bathing remained reserved only for necessity. Through these layers of experience, the act of bathing lost its neutrality. It became a threshold between everyday life and memories of Cressissa, quiet reminder of moments when the body felt weakest. Women stepped around that threshold carefully, choosing routines that sustained not only their physical comfort, but their emotional safety. The shadow of medical ritual turned bathing into an act weighted with memory, drawing women away from full immersion and toward gentler methods of care. Their reluctance reflected not ignorance, but the emotional residue of illness and childbirth. As these feelings settled into daily life, the water itself introduced dangers far more immediate than symbolism, deepening the distance between women. And the practice of bathing water in Victorian homes carried a danger that settled quietly into daily life, shaping how women approached cleanliness long before they stepped near a basin. Streams, wells, and communal pumps offered water that appeared harmless at first glance, yet each drop carried traces of soil, waste, and debris gathered along its path. Even households that prided themselves on order and discipline could not escape the unseen world moving through their buckets and pitchers. Women understood these risks not through scientific explanation, but through experience. They saw how a small scrape on a child's knee could sour within days, darkening around the edges and swelling with heat. They watched neighbors fall ill after washing in water that looked clear but carried contamination invisible to the eye. In such an environment, the act of bathing shifted from a gesture of cleanliness to a moment when the body was made vulnerable to the very substance meant to cleanse it. Small wounds, so common in daily life, became gateways for infection. A woman might cut her hand while preparing vegetables or scrape her arm on rough wood while tending to the fire. These injuries, minor in appearance, posed a real threat when exposed to contaminated water. After washing, redness often deepened, tenderness spread, and fever sometimes followed. Household remedies could soothe symptoms, but rarely halted the infection entirely. Families saw these patterns often enough to form a quiet understanding. Water was not always a friend. Mothers warned their children not to soak their cuts. Women hesitated before allowing water to touch their skin unless necessary. The fear grew slowly but steadily, reinforced by each small infection that took hold with alarming ease. Bathing increased this exposure dramatically. A full wash meant immersing or repeatedly splashing the skin, allowing water to touch every vulnerable area. The face, with its delicate pores and thin skin-absorbed contaminants, quickly. The body, stripped of layers of clothing, faced the water without protection. Women who attempted to bathe noticed that irritation followed even when no visible wound existed. Skin that had been calm before bathing sometimes reddened or itched, signaling the presence of minerals, dirt, or bacteria carried in the water. These reactions discouraged repetition. Women began to view bathing not as a means of prevention, but as a potential cause of discomfort or illness. The water itself offered few reassurances. Wells dug too close to homes collected runoff from yards where waste accumulated. Puddles near communal pumps absorbed refuse from the street. Rivers used for both washing and disposal carried a mixture of industrial waste, animal remains, and domestic refuse. Water drawn from these sources often held a faint odor or a cloudy tint, but even when it appeared clear, families understood that danger might still lurk within it. Women heating water over the fire sometimes saw small flecks or sediment settle at the bottom of the pot. These particles served as subtle reminders of what the water had touched on its way to their homes. Because these hazards were widely recognized, avoidance became a form of self-protection. Women learned to limit the amount of water that touched their skin, choosing quick wipes over immersion. The cloth allowed them to control the source of moisture, using only enough water to refresh the surface without soaking the body. This method reduced the risk of contaminants entering the pores or settling into small abrasions. The cloth acted as a filter barrier between the body and the dangerous water that surrounded them daily. Women trusted this method not because it aligned with modern standards, but because it consistently protected them from the irritation and infections that full bathing sometimes caused. Fear of infection extended into household routines. Water left standing in basins grew stale, quickly developing an odor that suggested decay. Women emptied basins frequently, sometimes discarding water before it could be used for washing. They scrubbed containers to prevent buildup, yet residues persisted over time. These patterns reinforced the belief that water, though essential, demanded caution. Even laundering clothes required vigilance. Reactions on the hands after wringing garments or soaking fabric reminded women that water carried more than cleansing potential. Conversations within communities strengthened these observations. Stories circulated about infections that worsened after bathing, about fevers that began with nothing more than a small scrape washed in dirty water. Women shared remedies and warnings, teaching one another which conditions required careful handling. These accounts, though informal, shaped collective wisdom. The message passed from neighbor to neighbor was clear. Bathing exposed the entire body at once, leaving it open to risks better avoided. This understanding shaped how women viewed risk itself. They recognized that life already carried numerous hazards: illness, poor sanitation, and the unpredictable nature of medical care. In such a world, avoiding unnecessary exposure felt sensible. Bathing, once framed as a luxury or moral preference, now carried practical implications. It became another calculation within the complex balancing act of Victorian survival. Women acted not out of ignorance, but out of experience, the path that aligned with their observations and protected their families. Over time, these habits shaped identity and expectation. Cleanliness came to mean avoiding harm rather than achieving purity. A woman who refrained from bathing did so with intention, understanding that her choice protected her health. Her decision reflected realism rather than neglect. Within this framework, the occasional wipe with a cloth or scented water became more than a substitute. It became a safe alternative to a practice that too often invited trouble. The danger carried in contaminated water reshaped bathing into a moment of risk, teaching women to guard their skin from anything that might invite infection. Their habits grew from caution rather than disregard, shaped by the threats that filled their homes and streets. As water grew colder and rooms remained drafty, another belief took root, warning that even temperature itself could harm the body. In ways no one wished to test, Victorian women lived in homes where temperature shifted with every draft, where warmth gathered only in narrow pockets near the stove, and where the cold pressed constantly against walls that offered little protection. Within this fragile balance, the body itself became something to guard carefully. Many believed that sudden temperature changes strained the heart, weakened the lungs, or opened the door to illness that lingered long after winter had passed. Bathing, exposure to warm water, and then stepping into air chilled by stone floors and thin windows embodied precisely the kind of shock they hoped to avoid. The moment a woman undressed, she relinquished the layers that shielded her from cold, allowing the air to bite at her skin before the water even touched it. The warmth of the bath, brief and uneven, did little to counter the cold that waited on the other side of the basin. The ritual of heating water intensified this belief. Women carried boiling water from the stove, steam rising from the bucket, warming their faces for only a moment before disappearing into the air. As they mixed hot and cold water to create something tolerable, they watched the heat dissipate almost instantly. A basin that felt warm at the beginning of the wash often cooled before the bath had truly begun. To immerse the body in such water meant entering a cycle of fluctuation, first warm, then cool, then cold, that reinforced fears about the body failing under sudden shifts. Families shared stories of neighbors who collapsed after stepping from warm baths into cold room styles that needed no confirmation to cement themselves into communal belief. The heart, in particular, became a focus of worry. Women spoke quietly about the dangers of warm water causing expansion and cold air triggering contraction, imagining the heart struggling within the chest to adjust to these opposing forces. Though the explanation lacked scientific grounding, the fear felt logical in a world where illness struck without warning and where even minor ailments could escalate into lasting weakness. Mothers repeated these warnings to their daughters, said them to avoid unnecessary washing during the winter months. They believed that protecting the heart required maintaining steady bodily warmth and avoiding rituals that introduced abrupt contrast. The rooms themselves intensified this caution. Kitchens radiated heat, while hallways remained icy. Bedrooms often unheated, trapped cold air that pooled near the floor. A woman preparing to bathe needed to move between these spaces. Each step altered the temperature around her body. To remove clothing in such an environment felt reckless. Even the act of wrapping a towel around her shoulders after washing offered little protection. The towel absorbed moisture quickly, becoming damp and heavy in the cold. Returned almost immediately. Women learned that warmth gained during bathing could not be sustained, making the entire ritual feel like a threat rather than a comfort. Winter deepened these concerns dramatically. The cold seeped into every surface of the home, lingering in basins, walls, and fabrics. Water that cooled quickly in summer now turned frigid moments after being mixed. Steam hung in the air only briefly, and warm spots near the stove disappeared when the fire burned low. Women moved cautiously through these months, layering garments and seeking warmth wherever it could be found. Bathing during this season felt like an invitation to illness. Those who attempted it often rushed through the process, leaving their skin half-washed and their bodies tense from the effort to avoid shivering. They understood that allowing the chill to settle into their bodies invited weakness that could last for weeks. Stories passed among women reinforced these anxieties. A neighbor who fell ill after bathing became an example, whispered in doorways and along fences. Children who caught chills after washing their hair served as warnings against winter baths. Even those who doubted the most extreme claims could not ignore the patterns they observed. Illness followed cold exposure often enough that bathing felt like an unnecessary risk. Avoidance became an act of caution, rather than neglect, one that aligned with experience. And the advice of elders, doctors of the era, contributed to these beliefs, warning patients about the dangers of opening the pores and then exposing the body to drafts. Their words carried authority even when not fully understood. Women internalized these cautions, viewing bathing as something to be approached only when conditions allowed the body to remain warm afterward. The heart, lungs, and skin felt vulnerable in ways that shaped decisions more strongly than convenience ever could. Bathing became an act that required not just water and privacy, but the cooperation of the weather itself. Because of these beliefs, many women restricted bathing during the colder months, relying instead on wiping the body with warm cloths that did not expose them to temperature shifts. These cloths retained heat longer than basins and minimized the amount of skin left uncovered. The method aligned with both physical comfort and cultural wisdom, offering a sense of safety that full immersion could not. Women used this technique consistently through long winters, emerging only occasionally for full washes when warmth returned and rooms could hold heat more reliably. Over time, the idea that bathing endangered the heart became woven into the rhythm of the year. Women approached winter with a plan for maintaining hygiene that protected their health while respecting the limitations of their environment. Their decisions reflected not fearfulness, but a practical understanding of survival within homes where cold governed everything from sleep to work to the simple act of drawing water. The belief that sudden temperature changes could weaken the body transformed bathing into a dangerous ritual in the eyes of Victorian women, habits shaped by cold rooms and fragile health. Their caution stemmed from lived experience rather than superstition. With this fear settled firmly into their routines, the next barrier to bathing arose from the very garments that accompanied them through each day. Clothing, for women of the era, demanded constant care, and no garments required more attention or caution than the layers worn closest to the skin. Underclothes served as both barrier and necessity, absorbing the traces of daily labor, while protecting outer garments from wear. Yet these pieces were few in number, often limited to a single set or two that had to endure years of washing, drying, and repair. Their scarcity shaped how women approached cleanliness itself. Washing these items took far more effort than simply rinsing a dress or apron. Fabric soaked through easily, became heavy with water, and clung stubbornly to moisture in homes where warmth barely reached beyond the stove. The difficulty of caring for these garments gradually altered how women understood the value of bathing, making full immersion far less appealing than the practical methods they relied on each day. Laundry began as a physical battle against cold water and limited space. Women prepared basins with water warmed as much as fuel allowed, yet the heat faded almost immediately once exposed to the air. Fingers numbed within moments of scrubbing fabric, and soap irritated skin already raw from winter's dryness. Underclothes made from cotton or linen absorbed water, rapidly adding weight that slowed each movement. Women needed to wring and beat the cloth to remove dirt, knowing that too much force risked damaging seams, while too little left the fabric unclean. The process unfolded, slowly demanding energy that many had already spent caring for children or tending to housework. Even when washing was successful, another challenge awaited. Drying proved even more difficult. In households where fires burned low to save fuel, warmth concentrated only in the smallest patches of the room. Women spread garments near the hearth, turning them repeatedly, trying to keep them from scorching. Farther from the fire, the air held too much moisture for drying to happen effectively. Fabric stiffened in the cold, remaining damp long after women needed to wear them again. Sometimes garments lay stretched across chairs or hung from improvised lines for days before losing their chill. With so few undergarments to rotate, washing even one piece meant risking hours or days without a replacement. Women faced an uncomfortable choice: wear a damp garment and invite illness, or forego bathing altogether to avoid needing to wash the garment in the first place. Winter magnified these challenges. Cold crept into every crack of the home, seeping into fabric and slowing the drying process to a crawl. Water cooled too quickly to offer comfort during washing. The steam rising from a basin disappeared in seconds, forming only a hint of warmth before fading completely. Undergarments took on a heavier, almost frozen quality in winter, air-resisting efforts to dry them even when placed near the stove. Families gathered tightly around the fire for heat, leaving little space for laundry. A woman forced to dry garments during this season navigated a cramped cluster of pots, boots, chairs, and bodies, trying to coax warmth into cloth before the next day began. Through these intertwined pressures, bathing slowly shifted from an act of refreshment to an impractical demand. The fragility of essential garments shaped what hygiene could realistically look like, guiding women toward smaller, safer rituals rather than full immersion. The fragility of undergarments and the labor required to maintain them turned bathing into a reminder of scarcity, persuading women to conserve both fabric and warmth. Their routines reflected a world where garments guided decisions as firmly as custom as household expectations deepened around them. Marital roles introduced an influence that quietly shaped how rarely a woman stepped toward the water. Bathing was often viewed as unnecessary for married women in Victorian life, a belief shaped by the heavy rhythm of domestic responsibilities and the quiet expectations that surrounded a household. Their days began early and ended late, moving through chores that filled the hours with constant tasks, leaving little space for practices considered optional. Water, fuel, and time were resources a family guarded closely, and a married woman learned quickly which activities were seen as worthy of those resources and which were not. Bathing, in most homes, belonged to the second category. It was not that women felt indifferent to their own comfort, but that the structure of their lives left little room for what was considered indulgent. Cleanliness did not carry the modern meaning of personal care or dignity. It was viewed through the lens of practicality, morality, and economic strain. And within that framework, a married woman often found herself at the very end of her own priorities. The work of the home consumed nearly every hour. Heat had to be maintained, meals had to be prepared, laundry washed by hand, children minded, and fires tended before they faded. None of these tasks paused to allow a long bath or even the preparation of one. Women were expected to manage every detail of the household, moving steadily from one need to another, and bathing simply did not fit into a schedule where even rest was rationed. A basin and cloth were considered sufficient, efficient, and appropriate. A full bath required rearranging tasks, preparing water, and committing precious time to an act that offered little return in the eyes of those who judged a woman's worth by her productivity, not her comfort. Taking time that many felt they could not justify. The idea that a married woman deserved such care for herself alone was rarely acknowledged. Expectations within marriage reinforced this attitude. Husbands did not typically demand that their wives smell pleasant or look refreshed in the way modern standards might suggest. The scent of labor, of cooking, of cold smoke, and even of sweat was viewed as normal within a working household. A woman was measured not by her fragrance, but by her ability to maintain order and fulfill her role without complaint. It can feel almost darkly humorous that a woman could run an entire home, yet be told that tending to her own body was unnecessary. A wife's cleanliness was not a pressing concern, unless illness threatened or childbirth approached. And even then, practices were chosen with caution rather than comfort. Many women learned to associate bathing with disruption rather than relief. The absence of social expectation added another layer. In many communities, personal hygiene remained tied to moral restraint rather than physical well-being. Excessive bathing was whispered about as vanity, wastefulness, or a married woman who seemed too attentive to her appearance risked drawing unnecessary attention. The safest path was modesty, discretion, and practicality. A quick wipe with warm water maintained respectability without appearing concerned with luxury. Modern life, with its shower routines and scented soaps, would seem almost extravagant to those households where cleanliness was achieved one cloth at a time. What mattered most was completing the tasks that sustained the household. If water was scarce or cold, bathing was postponed. If fuel was needed for cooking, it was not wasted on heating a tub. If laundry was piled high, Washing undergarments or linens took precedence over washing skin. Women lived within these calculations every day, balancing what could be done with what must be done. And in that balance, bathing repeatedly fell to the bottom. The discomfort of skipping it was accepted as part of the role, much like sleepless nights and unending labor. A deeper truth lay beneath these patterns, shaped by generations before them. Cleanliness in the modern sense of hygiene was not embedded in mainstream understanding. Illness was attributed to miasmas, cold air, or moral weakness rather than germs on the skin. A married woman responsible for the well-being of her family clung to the practices she believed protected them. If bathing was thought to weaken the body or open pathways for sickness, it made sense to avoid it. Protective habits became traditions. Traditions became expectations. An expectation shaped daily life. I find it quietly sobering to imagine a woman standing beside a cold basin, choosing once again to forego bathing not out of preference, but out of duty. The home demanded her presence. Warmth was too precious to waste, and no one encouraged her to care for herself beyond what was strictly required. These choices were not made lightly, but were shaped by the pressures of class, custom, and survival. Within that world, neglecting a full bath was not neglect at all. It was practicality, sacrifice, and alignment with the values around her. The acceptance of limited bathing did not stem from laziness or ignorance. It was a response to a life structured around obligation, where the needs of others always rose above personal comfort. Married women understood their environment intimately. They knew how quickly heat escaped a room, how expensive soap could be, how heavy wet clothing felt in winter, and how quickly chores multiplied when left unattended. Every decision, including whether to bathe, was weighed within this reality. Domestic duties and shifting expectations turned bathing into something easily postponed, leaving women to move through each day with cleanliness pushed far behind obligation. That pattern shaped the rhythm of countless households and slowly reshaped the meaning of comfort itself. When the state of the home began to collide with neglected infrastructure, another barrier rose that silently discouraged even the thought of stepping toward water. Bathing became even more difficult when the conditions inside Victorian homes forced women to confront a kind of discomfort that felt closer to danger than inconvenience. The layout of many houses placed the washing area near drains that were already overwhelmed by daily waste. The pipes were narrow, the angles were poor, and the water carried not only household refuse, but everything that flowed from crowded streets. When these channels failed to move the waste outward, the foul mixture sometimes pushed back toward kitchens, hallways, and corners where women attempted their limited forms of cleansing. A simple task, such as filling a basin, could suddenly be interrupted by the smell of rising sewage turning. Even the idea of bathing into something unsettling. Many homes relied on makeshift systems of wooden troughs, shallow pits, or crude openings that guided used water toward the nearest communal channel. Heavy rain clogged passages, or the pressure of too many households using the same lines could reverse the flow without warning. Women woke to find puddles forming under doors or creeping up from beneath loose floorboards. The odor traveled quickly, settling into fabrics, wallpaper, and bedding. It created a heaviness inside the house that lingered long after the source was removed. In such conditions, bathing felt less like a path toward cleanliness and more like exposing the body to a space that no longer felt safe. Indoor sanitation had not kept pace with population growth. Entire districts struggled with drainage systems designed for far fewer people than they now held. Wastewater mixed readily with surface runoff, carrying soil, refuse, and matter that spread illness through neighborhoods. Women knew from experience that contact with contaminated water often brought fever or persistent skin irritation. A small cut on the hand or leg became a reason for caution because the water that reached their homes could easily worsen it. They had seen neighbors fall ill after handling garments washed in tainted basins or after stepping barefoot on damp floors near unstable drains. These memories shaped their decisions, guiding them away from unnecessary exposure. The bathroom, if it could be called that, was usually nothing more than a lit corner holding a basin or tub. It sat close to the same lines that carried the worst smells from beneath the house. The wooden floorboards absorbed moisture and softened over time, allowing mold to grow in layers that resisted scrubbing. Each attempt to clean the space seemed to stir up more odor than before. Women noticed how quickly the room filled with dampness once the water was poured. The combination of heat, steam, and the lingering stench made them move quickly, leaving little chance to bathe without discomfort. The lack of separation between living space and sanitation meant the sounds and smells of the drain often reached areas where families slept or worked. It was difficult to relax when the house reminded them of what flowed beneath it. Women carried the responsibility of household management and often faced the burden of confronting these conditions directly. They inspected drains for blockages, cleared debris from narrow channels, and attempted to keep odor at bay using cloths soaked in herbs or vinegar. These measures worked only for short periods. Eventually, the smell returned, and with it came hesitation about using water in ways that spread moisture across the room. Bathing near a source of foul air felt not only unpleasant, but risky. Women feared the invisible threats that seemed to rise with the odor. They believed the air around tainted water could weaken the body or intensify sickness already present in the home. Many avoided the area unless necessary, choosing to wash hands, arms, and faces far from the drains instead. Even these partial efforts required planning, because any spilled water added dampness to spaces already struggling to stay dry. A full bath demanded more water, more time, and far greater contact with the environment they tried to avoid. For many families, the idea of pouring clean water into a room affected by sewage felt contradictory. It seemed to waste something valuable while offering no real sense of renewal. Women preferred to stay dressed, layering garments to shield themselves from the cold and from surfaces touched by dampness. A bath required undressing, standing near the drain, and tolerating odor that made breathing uncomfortable. They saw little reason to endure that experience when they could. Instead, wipe the skin with a cloth warmed by the fire. This method felt more controlled, cleaner in practice than stepping into a space they associated with contamination. Homes in poorer districts faced the worst conditions. Several families often shared the same drainage pipe. When one household emptied a bucket or washed clothing. The runoff sometimes flowed into another home. These households lived in constant awareness of what might seep through cracked floors or along uneven bricks. Women who had experienced repeated flooding or unexpected surges of wastewater learned to avoid the washing space unless necessary. Their routines adjusted accordingly, with bathing becoming rarer and shorter. Each year, cleanliness in the traditional sense felt out of reach, replaced by a system of compromise built around caution. Over time, this environment shaped not only habits but attitudes. Bathing no longer carried the promise of comfort or refreshment. It became linked to the anxiety that something unpleasant could emerge without warning. Women balanced the desire for cleanliness against the realities of their homes, choosing the safest option, even if it meant limiting how often they immersed themselves in water. In their world, restraint was not neglect, but a form of protection against what they feared could touch their bodies. Sewage-filled rooms and unstable drains pushed bathing far from daily reach, caution into a routine shaped by the conditions inside the home. These choices reflected households adapting to a world where comfort often conflicted with safety. When the burden of illness shaped the beliefs of older generations, another influence emerged that subtly guided how families viewed the practice of bathing. The hesitation toward bathing deepened in many households because older family members carried beliefs that shaped the routines of everyone around them. These elders had grown up in environments where water was linked not to renewal but to weakness. Their memories were filled with stories of neighbors who became ill after washing during the cold months, or relatives who fainted after soaking their bodies in warm basins. These accounts spread quietly across generations until they formed something close to a family rule. When elders spoke of water taking vitality from the body, younger relatives listened without question, accepting this idea as part of the logic of daily life. For older women and men, the body was thought to hold a limited reserve of energy that needed careful protection. Anything that caused sudden changes in temperature or opened the skin to dampness was believed to unsettle this reserve. Bathing stirred both conditions, making the act feel more threatening than helpful. Elders described how warmth from a basin could relax the body so deeply that it left a person weak for hours afterward. In cold seasons, the shock of stepping from a heated bath back into a drafty room seemed even more dangerous. These impressions shaped how the elderly spoke about bathing, framing it as a practice that took more strength than it gave. Children absorbed these warnings, early shaping their understanding before they formed habits of their own. A child who asked, "Bathe more frequently," might be told that too much washing thinned the body or disturbed its balance. When a relative fell ill, it was easy to point to the most recent bath as a possible cause. Without modern explanations, these interpretations became a natural response to sickness. The stories repeated often enough that they grew into a household truth. Parents repeated them because they had heard them from their own elders, and the pattern settled firmly into place. In this way, caution around bathing became part of family culture rather than an isolated superstition. The world in which these beliefs took shape offered many reasons for concern. Homes were cold during much of the year. Rooms warmed slowly and lost their heat, quickly making any exposure of the body feel risky. Drafts moved through thin walls and unsealed windows. Even a brief moment of chill could cause discomfort. Elders lived through these conditions when medical support was limited, so they relied on experience rather than instruction. If a bath had once preceded a fever, or if a young relative had weakened after washing, the connection seemed undeniable to them. Their understanding of health reflected the environment they inhabited. Women felt this influence most strongly because they carried responsibility for the cleanliness of the home as well as the health of the family. When elders advised them to avoid unnecessary bathing, these women adjusted their routines. They might wash their faces and hands with warm cloths, keeping the rest of the body covered to preserve heat. They prepared water only when essentialist, for infants or for relatives recovering from illness. In many households, a full bath was treated as a rare event, saved 4 times when it seemed unavoidable. This approach aligned with the concerns expressed by elders and was supported by the colder months that dominated much of the year. The belief that water could drain vitality influenced not only how often people bathed, but also how they perceived those who bathed more frequently. Elders viewed such habits with suspicion. Someone who washed too often risked becoming frailless, though the water pulled away something essential. They described this loss not in scientific terms, but in ordinary observations about posture, appetite, or mood. If a family member appeared tired after bathing, the elders pointed to the water as the reason. These interpretations persisted even when other causes were possible, reinforcing the belief that restraint protected health. Younger people internalized these lessons quietly. They learned to avoid stepping into cold rooms while undressed, to wait before washing after a long walk, and to treat warmth as something fragile. Over time, these practices became instinctive. They believed they were protecting themselves rather than limiting themselves. As they grew older and passed the same lessons to their children, the cycle strengthened. The warnings from the past became the habits of the present, shaping how a new generation understood the relationship between the body and water. The household environment supported these beliefs. Fires needed time and fuel to heat. Bathing water, both of which were often scarce. Clean water was limited. Many homes lacked spaces that felt warm enough to bathe comfortably. These conditions gave the elders further evidence that restraint made sense. When the environment offered little comfort, caution became a rational choice. Even if younger people questioned the belief that water drained strength, they still faced the practical difficulties that came with bathing. The elders simply gave voice to concerns that the environment already encouraged. What emerged from this pattern was a household atmosphere marked by careful management of the body. Bathing was not forbidden, but it was approached with hesitation. People washed enough to remain presentable while avoiding anything that felt excessive. Women carried the burden of maintaining this balance to the expectations and warnings that shaped their lives. The result was a family routine that placed cleanliness within limits defined partly by culture and partly by circumstance. The caution taught by older generations created a rhythm of restraint, guiding families to treat bathing as something that risked more than it offered. Their influence settled deeply into the routines of daily life, shaping decisions without force or pressure. As household priorities shifted toward outward presentation, a quiet change emerged that redefined what people believed it meant to be clean. Clean garments were treated as the most reliable marker of respectability, shaping how families approached hygiene in a practical and narrowly focused way. Clothing provided a visible surface that could be managed without confronting the discomfort and labor of bathing. Women understood that neighbors and visitors paid far more attention to fabric than to skin, so they directed their energy toward maintaining garments that looked fresh on when the body beneath had not been washed for days. This created a household rhythm that favored outward order, while allowing personal hygiene to shift quietly into the background. Laundry could be controlled in a way that bathing never could. Water for washing clothes did not have to be perfectly clean because fabric shielded the skin from direct contact with impurities. Women filled basins, scrubbed garments on worn boards, and rinsed them with whatever water was available, often mixing warm and cool water to make the process more efficient. These tasks could be done while fully clothed and did not require standing in a cold corner of the house. Laundry sessions fit naturally into the day, accompanied by the steady work of tending fires, preparing meals, or watching children. This convenience reinforced the belief that clean clothing alone represented an acceptable form of cleanliness. Bathing demanded a different level of effort. It required gathering enough water to fill a basin, heating it slowly over a fire, and finding a space warm enough to withstand undressing. Women already strained by daily labor viewed this process as exhausting rather than refreshing. The cold air that rushed through narrow hallways and loose window frames made the idea of removing layers of clothing uncomfortable even before the washing began. When conditions felt harsh and bathing seemed unnecessary compared to the controlled routine of laundering garments. Social expectations strengthened this preference. People judged one another primarily by the appearance of clothing. A neatly washed dress, a bright apron, or a well-maintained coat signaled discipline and propriety. These outward expressions of care carried more weight than the question of whether someone had bathed recently. Women understood that their families would be perceived through their garments, so they prioritized laundry as a way to sustain social reputation. Clean clothing became a tool for navigating community expectations, allowing households to appear orderly, even if personal hygiene remained limited. Undergarments added another layer of complexity. These pieces absorbed sweat and odor, yet were harder to wash, especially during colder months when drying took longer. Many families owned only a few sets and washing them frequently was difficult. Outer garments, however, could be cleaned more easily and displayed publicly, so they received more attention. Over time, this formed a pattern in which the outside layers defined cleanliness while the inner layers reflected the realities of scarcity. The belief that clean clothing mattered more took root partly because it aligned with what families could realistically maintain. Environmental conditions supported this shift. Water sources near homes were often contaminated. People understood the risks of placing their skin directly into water that could irritate or infect. Clothing offered a protective barrier. Garments washed in imperfect water still dried in the open air or near the fire, carrying minimal long-term risk. The skin did not share this advantage. Women had seen neighbors develop rashes after contact with poor quality water, or fall sick after washing during colder seasons. These observations encouraged caution and families to emphasize laundry over bathing. Indoor temperatures shaped habits as well. Homes struggled to retain warmth, and bathing required full exposure to drafty rooms. By contrast, laundry could be done in stages, allowing women to retreat to the fire whenever their hands stiffened from the cold. Clean clothing also brought immediate comfort because garments could be warmed before wearing. This small sense of relief made the routine feel rewarding, while bathing often led to discomfort once the warm water cooled or the air shifted. Laundry, therefore, became the most practical way to maintain a sense of order inside the home. Children learned early that clothing carried social value. They were taught to brush dust from sleeves, keep hems tidy, and avoid staining garments during daily activities. These lessons shaped how they viewed cleanliness. They grew up believing that well-kept clothing reflected personal discipline, while bathing remained something reserved for special circumstances rather than regular practice. This mindset continued into adulthood, enforcing a cycle in which garments defined hygiene far more than the body itself. Over time, the difference between washing the body and washing clothing became a quiet but significant division. Saw no contradiction in wearing clean garments over unwashed skin. The outward appearance satisfied social expectations. Women adapted their routines around this belief, devoting long hours to laundering and tending fabrics. The body waited for the rare occasions when conditions allowed a full bath-a-thon weeks apart. Cleanliness became a layered concept shaped by what could be seen rather than what could be felt. These habits reflected practicality rather than neglect. Families balanced limited resources, uncertain water quality, and difficult temperatures. Clean clothing was the most achievable expression of command, so it became the standard by which households measured themselves. The emphasis on fabric over skin created a version of cleanliness uniquely suited to Victorian lifewear. Outward presentation carried more weight than physical comfort. Garments shaped the household's definition of hygiene, allowing families to maintain dignity through fabric when bathing felt impractical or risky. This focus became a stable part of daily life, guiding routines across generations. Once scent began to stand in for water, a different expression of cleanliness quietly settled into place and prepared the way for another shift in daily habits. Scent slowly took the place of water in many Victorian households, shaping a version of cleanliness built upon fragrance rather than bathing. Women discovered that a few drops of strong perfume or simple essential oils could mask the odor that came from long days spent in heavy clothing and crowded rooms. This approach demanded far less effort than heating water, preparing a bathing space, or undressing in the cold. The bottle of scent became an object kept close at hand, always ready to provide a sense of freshness whenever the environment felt too heavy or the body too warm from work. In a world shaped by limited resources, unreliable water, and crowded homes, fragrance offered a small but manageable escape. Perfume held a special place among wealthier women who had access to stronger, longer-lasting oils. These fragrances were crafted to dominate the air around the wearer, creating an impression of refinement, even when bathing was infrequent. Strong floral notes or herbal mixtures blended easily with the sense of fabric and daily activity. Women applied these perfumes to collars, cuffs, or small squares of cloth placed discreetly inside bodices. The fragrance created a boundary between the body and the outside world, offering reassurance that no unwelcome scent would escape. This practice became a quiet ritual that replaced the more demanding routines of washing. For those with fewer means, simpler oils or diluted mixtures served the same purpose. A single bottle could last many weeks because only a small amount was needed to refresh clothing or soften the odor of unwashed skin. Women often applied the oils in the morning before beginning household tasks and again in the evening before resting. This pattern established a rhythm that paralleled the routines of more traditional hygiene, requiring water or warmth. The scent lingered on fabrics, carrying through the day even as the body beneath it remained untouched by bathing. The widespread use of fragrance also reflected social values. People equated pleasant odor with discipline and respectability. A well-scented woman appeared careful and attentive even if her bathing routine was limited. Perfume allowed families to maintain a sense of dignity within homes that lacked proper washing facilities. The fragrance masked the consequences of long hours spent indoors and the reality of wearing multiple layers of clothing that absorbed odor quickly. Cleanliness became something that could be produced through preparation rather than immersion, shaping how households defined acceptable hygiene. In many homes, the perfume bottle sat near dressing tables or small wooden shelves beside the bed. The scent rose gently each time the stopper was removed, bringing comfort to women who felt that bathing required more resources than they possessed. Fragrance symbolized a form of control in an environment where warmth, water, and privacy were unpredictable. The bottle offered a consistent solution. It became a tool for navigating social spaces, whether a woman was visiting neighbors, attending church, or sitting in a crowded room where odor traveled easily. The growing dependence on perfume was also encouraged by concerns about water quality. Bathing required placing the skin in direct contact with water that might irritate or infect. Women understood these risks and chose fragrance as a safer alternative. Clothes could be lightly scented without introducing moisture to spaces already struggling with mold or cold air. Unlike bathing, perfume required no preparation and introduced no discomfort. It fit naturally into the routines of everyday life, supporting the belief that scent alone could create an acceptable form of cleanliness. Perfume also shaped how women interacted with their clothing. They learned to layer scents carefully so that the fragrance moved through fabric in subtle ways. A small amount placed inside a glove or on a scarf created a consistent aura of freshness. These practices gave women a sense of confidence when they entered public spaces or received guests. The scent became part of their identity, linking fragrance to femininity, care, and presentation. Clothing that carried a pleasant smell signaled attention even when the body beneath had not been washed for several days. Younger women adopted these habits early. They watched their mothers prepare for outings by refreshing fabric with scent or applying a small amount behind the ear or along the neck. Over time, these gestures formed a quiet instruction passed from one generation to the next. The perfume bottle became a normal part of daily routines and a symbol of household order in families where bathing was infrequent. Fragrance filled the gap, offering a method for maintaining social acceptance without changing the underlying conditions. Even in poorer districts where resources were extremely limited, women found ways to incorporate scent into their routines. They mixed dried herbs, boiled citrus peels, or diluted oils purchased in small amounts. These scents did not last as long as the perfumes used by wealthier women, but they provided enough freshness to reduce discomfort. The fragrance softened the odor of shared rooms, unwashed bedding, and clothing worn for many days. In an environment shaped by survival rather than comfort, scent offered a brief moment of relief. Over time, fragrance became a replacement for the feeling of renewal that bathing might have provided. Women came to associate the smell of perfume with being presentable, clean, and ready to face the day. It was a practical adaptation in a world where bathing demanded too much time, effort, and risk. Perfume filled the role of cleanliness in a manner uniquely suited to the limitations of Victorian life, reinforcing the belief that a pleasant scent could stand in for the experience of washing. Fragrance became a practical substitute for bathing, offering women a manageable way to feel composed in homes where water, warmth, and privacy were limited. This shift reflected a broader adaptation to the pressures of daily life, shaping new interpretations of what it meant to be clean. Gradually, scented routines gave way to deeper currents of belief that connected the body to modesty and restraint, preparing the ground for a final layer of understanding about why bathing remained so rare. Religious ideas shaped how many Victorian women understood their bodies, their duties, and the limits placed upon physical care. In numerous households, the body was viewed as something that required restraint, concealment, and caution. Women learned from an early age that modesty extended far beyond clothing and behavior. It also included how often one should touch or tend to the skin. Bathing, though practical in its simplest form, carried meanings that reached into the moral expectations of the time. These expectations steered women toward routines that placed spiritual discipline above personal comfort, redefining what counted as acceptable hygiene. Families influenced by strict religious teachings approached the body with an These expectations steered women toward routines that placed spiritual discipline above personal comfort. Families influenced by strict religious teachings approached the body with an attitude formed by caution. The body was seen as a source of temptation or weakness if addressed too openly. Acts involving the removal of clothing were treated with hesitation, not because of the physical process itself, but because of the moral questions attached to it. Bathing, therefore, became a moment when the body felt too exposed, too visible, or too close to desires that religious teachings encouraged women to restrain. By limiting such practices, households believed they were cultivating strength and devotion. Women living under these expectations learned to associate frequent bathing with vanity or indulgence. Cleanliness of the skin was not presented as a sign of order or health, but unnecessary attention to the physical self. The focus of moral instruction turned toward discipline, leaving outward comfort in a secondary position. Bathing too often was described by elders as a habit that encouraged pride or distracted the mind from duties that mattered more. These ideas shaped how entire generations approached their bodies, and the effects were felt in daily routines that favored restraint over ease. Households that upheld these beliefs created domestic environments where privacy was limited and bathing spaces felt unimportant. Women washed their hands and faces as needed, but avoided full immersion, except in moments viewed as essential. Illness, childbirth, or preparation for religious events offered rare circumstances when bathing gained temporary approval. Outside those moments, families encouraged minimal contact with water. Many women believed they were practicing humility by reducing the number of times they bathed. The decision reinforced the idea that care of the soul mattered more than care of the skin. Clothing also played a role in shaping these patterns. Full coverage was expected in many religiously influenced communities, and layers of fabric became a physical expression of modesty. Removing these layers to bathe felt contradictory to the values that guided women through their days. They preferred to preserve the boundaries that clothing provided. Even within the home, these habits became so common that many women no longer questioned them. Bathing shifted from a routine act of care to something that felt morally charged and difficult to justify. The fear of appearing indulgent shaped how many women interpreted hygiene. Scented oils, fine soaps, and warm baths carried an association with luxury, and luxury was often treated with suspicion. Women were encouraged to avoid anything that could be interpreted as self-centered or unnecessary. They directed their attention toward household work, religious instruction, and family duties. By limiting personal comfort, women believed they were strengthening their character. Bathing was therefore viewed not only through physical discomfort or poor infrastructure, also through beliefs that interpreted the act as misaligned with spiritual priorities. Ideas influenced how communities judged one another. A woman who bathed too frequently might be viewed as someone who valued physical beauty over modesty. Neighbors interpreted these habits through their own moral frameworks, reinforcing pressure to maintain restraint. Such judgments shaped how families organized their routines. Personal care below domestic tasks or social expectations. Women learned to navigate their lives within these boundaries, choosing minimal hygiene practices that aligned with the values of those around them. In some households, elders passed down stories that connected bodily discomfort to moral development. Difficult conditions were believed to strengthen the spirit, while comfort was seen as something that might weaken resolve. Women internalized these lessons, choosing practices that maintained continuity with past generations. Even when new ideas began to circulate in urban areas, many communities held to their established patterns. Religious influences remained strong, not because of strict enforcement, but because they provided a sense of stability in changing times. The environment itself supported these beliefs. Cold houses, poor sanitation, and limited privacy made bathing difficult, and religious interpretations gave meaning to these conditions. Women viewed their adaptation not as a failure of resources, but as evidence of discipline. By declining to bathe when the environment felt too uncomfortable or exposed, they believed they were choosing a path aligned with faith rather than simply reacting to hardship. This added dimension to practices already shaped by scarcity, reinforcing the idea that restraint held value. Over time, these perspectives influenced how women understood their bodies. Cleanliness became something defined by spirit, intention, and social presence, rather than the regular washing of skin. Women carried themselves with dignity through clothing, fragrance, and careful behavior, allowing physical discomfort to settle quietly into their routines. Their understanding of hygiene developed within a complex mixture of faith, practicality, and tradition. The result was a version of cleanliness that reflected both the environment around them and the values within their homes. Daily life continued within these boundaries. As families moved through the demands of work, worship, and survival, bathing remained an act shaped by caution, belief, and the pressures of modesty. Women found ways to feel presentable without relying on immersion in water, accepting these routines as part of their identity. Cleanliness became an inward expression rather than an outward pursuit, in values that guided their decisions about every aspect of care. Religious expectations drew women further from the idea of regular bathing, turning restraint into a form of devotion supported by household routines. These beliefs shaped how families balanced morality, comfort, and care. Long after such ideas began to soften, memories of these habits continued to influence how cleanliness was understood. Thank you for spending this time walking through the quiet details of Victorian life. May your evening settle gently, and may rest come easily as the world grows still. Good night.